Don't fight them, Maddie. Cal Maddox's voice didn't shake. Not once. He was on his knees in the mud, hands locked behind his back, 5 patrol cars surrounding him like a wall, and he was looking straight at his daughter. Find out who needed me gone. Madison stood in the doorway, still wearing her nursing scrubs, fresh off a 12-hour night shift, and she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The neighbors were already filming, already judging, already decided. That's the moment this story begins. Not with a crime, with a lie so well constructed, it nearly destroyed an innocent man and the one piece of faded fabric that forced a sheriff to question everything he thought he knew. If this is the kind of story that makes you stop scrolling, we'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and follow this all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far the story travels. The rain had been falling since before sunrise, the kind of slow, heavy Oregon rain that soaks into everything: jackets, boots, the ground itself. By the time the first patrol vehicle turned off Route 9 toward Cal Maddox's repair yard on the edge of Briar Ridge, the mud was already thick and dark and holding every impression like memory. There were 5 of them. 5 patrol vehicles, rolling in without sirens, without announcement. Sheriff Grant Holloway led the column himself, which meant this wasn't routine. Grant Holloway didn't ride out personally for possession calls or outstanding warrants on minor charges. He sent his deputies for those. The fact that he was sitting behind the wheel of the lead vehicle, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the garage ahead, that told the 2 deputies riding with him everything they needed to know about how seriously this was being taken. Deputy Lena Ortiz was the second vehicle back. She hadn't slept. She'd been on the night rotation and had caught the tail end of the briefing at 5:45 that morning, bleary-eyed over bad coffee, listening to Chief Deputy Nolan Pierce lay out the arrest plan with the kind of practiced efficiency that made it sound like everything was already decided. The suspect, the evidence, the outcome. All of it packaged so cleanly that Lena had felt the first small pinch of unease somewhere below her sternum. The way you feel when you read a sentence too fast and realize something doesn't quite fit. She hadn't said anything. Pierce didn't invite questions. And besides, the evidence was what it was. A stolen black pickup, an anonymous tip, footage, fingerprints. All of it pointing at Cal Maddox, owner of Maddox Automotive, known associate and senior member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Briar Ridge chapter. She'd told herself the unease was tiredness. She was wrong. Cal heard them coming. He was already in the workshop at that hour, had been since 5, the way he'd been every morning for 11 years. The shop opened at 7, but Cal ran on a different clock, the kind of schedule built from decades of needing to be useful before the rest of the world was awake. He had a veteran's generator half dismantled on the main workbench, the job he'd driven nearly 40 miles to start 2 days prior, and his hands were already dark with grease to the wrist when he heard tires on the gravel and looked up. He heard more than one vehicle. He heard the pattern rolling slow, spreading out across the yard. He knew what that meant. He'd known enough law enforcement in his life to recognize a containment formation when he heard one. He set down the wrench. He pulled a shop rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands, not because it mattered, but because the 5 seconds he had left where everything was still normal. Then he walked to the workshop door and opened it. Grant Holloway was already out of the vehicle, already moving toward the garage with 4 deputies fanning out around the property. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that had helped him win 3 elections in a county where voters still wanted their sheriff to look like a sheriff. His face was set in the flat, practiced expression of official authority, the expression that said he had decided what this was before he arrived. Calvin Maddox. Grant's voice cut through the rain. Cal stepped out of the doorway. He didn't put his hands up. He didn't back away. He stood like a man who had nothing to hide and no particular fear of people who thought he did, which is its own kind of statement when there are 10 deputies and 5 vehicles arrayed against you. Sheriff, Cal said. Not a question, just an acknowledgement. We have a warrant for your arrest, possession of stolen property, conspiracy to commit armed robbery, suspected involvement in the theft and armed robbery at Decker Warehouse, Tuesday night. Grant kept his voice level. I'm asking you to comply without incident. Cal was already nodding slowly. You mind telling me what property we're talking about? There's a black pickup registered as stolen in connection with the warehouse robbery. It's behind your garage. Cal didn't flinch. He looked at Grant for a long beat. Is it? It is, Grant said. Then somebody put it there, Cal said. Because I didn't. Grant's expression didn't shift. Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. And that was the moment the door at the side of the house opened. Madison Maddox was 24 years old, small-framed, with a kind of tiredness in her face that comes from working night shifts in an emergency department and genuinely caring about every patient she sees. She was still in her nursing scrubs pale blue, the pocket on her chest stamped with the Briar Ridge Regional logo, and her jacket was half-zipped, like she'd heard the cars and come outside too fast to finish getting dressed. She stopped dead when she saw the vehicles, when she counted the deputies, when she understood in the space of a breath what was happening. Dad, stay there, Maddie. Cal's voice didn't change. Same tone, same steadiness. He was already turning to face away from Grant, already beginning to comply, and his eyes found his daughter over his shoulder like a compass needle finding north. You stay right where you are. You have done nothing wrong. You don't move unless they tell you to, and you don't argue. You hear me? Dad, what is this? What are they? Maddie, just her name. Just the tone. The tone that had been putting her back together since she was 9 years old and the world first started falling apart. I need you to be calm. Can you do that for me? She pressed her hand against her mouth. Her eyes were already burning, but she nodded. Grant gestured to his deputy, and the cuffs came out. The neighbors arrived, the way they always do, drawn by some animal instinct toward anything that breaks the ordinary silence of early morning. 3 houses down, a man stepped out onto his porch with his coffee still steaming. Across the road, a woman in a bathrobe pulled her front door open, and then the door wider, and then reached back inside for her phone. A truck slowed on Route 9 and stayed slow, the driver craning to see. Within 4 minutes, 7 people were filming. They'd all seen the news. The warehouse robbery had been covered heavily, 2 employees roughed up, property damage in the 6 figures, and the community had its own memory of Cal Maddox, a large man, quiet in the wrong kind of way, never unfriendly but never exactly approachable, with a Hell's Angels patch on his back that said everything some people needed to know and nothing that made them want to know more. He'd lived in Briar Ridge for 16 years, ran a business that half the town used, but he was still and always going to be the biker with the criminal-adjacent reputation that nobody could prove, but everybody quietly assumed. Now 5 high-troll cars were in his yard at dawn. That was proof enough for the audience on Route 9. Grant moved behind Cal to apply the restraints. And out of professional habit, out of the same careful instinct that had kept him alive through 22 years of law enforcement, he pulled back the lapel of Cal's leather vest to ensure there were no weapons accessible along the back waistband. And he stopped. Not dramatically, not loudly. He stopped the way a man stops when his body understands something. His brain hasn't processed yet a full, complete cessation of motion. Every muscle just suddenly at rest. Sewn into the inside lining of the vest, between the leather and the quilted backing, was a patch, small, faded, the embroidery fraying at the corners from years of wear. A volunteer patch, the kind that emergency service workers sewed onto gear as identification during large-scale disaster operations, back before everything went digital. It read, Briar Ridge Volunteer Rescue Lost Creek Fire, 2008. And beneath the text, hand-stitched in a slightly different thread, G.H. Grant Holloway's throat closed. He stood there in the rain, holding back the lapel of this man's vest, staring at a patch the size of a playing card, and the world narrowed to just that. His son had been 14. The evacuation bus, carrying youths out of the Lost Creek burn zone, had stalled on a switchback road with the fire line moving fast. The driver was already out. Most of the kids had gotten off. But Danny Holloway had been at the back, and the smoke had reached the cabin before Danny could get to the door. And by the time anyone understood he was still inside, the visibility was almost nothing, and the fire was 20 yards from the road. Grant had been a deputy then. He'd been working the perimeter half a mile away when the call came over the radio, and he'd known with the absolute terrible certainty of a parent that he wasn't going to reach his son in time. Someone else had. A large man, blonde, wearing a volunteer rig and a breathing mask, moving through the smoke toward the bus at a full run while everyone else was moving away. He'd gone in through the emergency rear exit. He'd come out carrying Danny over one shoulder, already unconscious from smoke inhalation, and he'd set the boy down at the roadside with hands that knew what they were doing, and then he'd gone back toward the fire because there were still people unaccounted for. By the time Grant arrived, by the time Danny was on a stretcher and breathing, and the fire was being contained, the blonde volunteer was gone. No name, no record of who had signed in on that end of the perimeter that day. Just a scorched patch that had fallen from his gear, found in the road near the bus, which Grant had picked up and kept for 17 years because it was the only piece of evidence that the man had ever existed. The patch Grant kept in his study at home, mounted in a small frame behind glass, was identical to the one he was looking at right now. He didn't move for a long moment. The deputy beside him had noticed and was watching him with the specific, careful uncertainty of someone who doesn't know whether to ask. Grant let the lapel go. His hands were not entirely steady. "Turn around," he said to Cal. His voice came out lower than he intended. Cal turned. He looked at Grant's face and understood immediately that something had changed. Though he kept his own expression neutral, reading the room the way a man reads any situation he's walked into without full information. "Your name is on that patch," Grant said. "On the inside. The initials are mine," Cal said. "GH," Grant said. "You stitched GH on a volunteer rescue patch. It was a Lost Creek patch. Emergency services issue. You stitched your own initials so you could identify your gear if it ended up with someone else in the smoke." Cal's voice was quiet, even. "Standard procedure for the volunteer crews. Then what does GH stand for if it's your patch?" Cal held Grant's gaze. "Gerald Harold. My given name. Nobody's called me that since my mother died." Grant said nothing for a moment. Around them, the deputies were watching, uncertain. The neighbors on Route 9 were still filming. Madison had her arms wrapped around herself in the doorway, and she didn't understand what she was seeing on her father's face or on the sheriff's. But she understood that something had shifted, something beneath the surface that she couldn't name. "There was a bus," Grant said, low enough that only Cal could hear. "Lost Creek evacuation route, 2008, back of the bus. 14-year-old boy." Cal looked at him steadily. "There were a lot of people that day." "Not on that bus," Grant said. "Not at that moment." Cal was quiet for a beat. Then he got out. The boy got out. "He's 31 now," Grant said. "He teaches high school math." His voice broke on the last word. "Just barely. Just enough. He doesn't remember the name of the man who carried him. Neither did I." He stopped, swallowed. "I've had a patch with those initials for 17 years. I assumed Gerald," Cal said, not unkindly. "People hear GH and fill in whatever makes sense to them. I didn't correct anyone because it didn't seem like it mattered who got the credit." Grant stood there in the rain, the arrest warrant in his hand, the handcuffs already on the man who had walked into a burning bus to save his son, and he felt the full weight of every assumption he'd ever made pressing down on him, like something he'd never be able to put down again. He cuffed him anyway, because the evidence was real and the warrant was real. And gratitude, no matter how deep, no matter how long carried, could not override law enforcement's legal obligation to a signed warrant. Grant Holloway had seen what happened to departments that let personal sentiment override procedure. He'd arrested his own cousin once. He understood that the badge meant nothing if it bent for private feeling. But he placed the cuffs with a care that none of his deputies could quite explain later when they tried to describe the arrest. And he kept Cal upright as he guided him toward the patrol vehicle, one hand on his arm, not harsh, not performative, From the doorway, Madison watched it all. "You can't do this," she said. Not loudly, not hysterically. Just the statement of a woman who had spent the night pulling people back from the edge of emergency and was now watching her father being treated like a criminal in front of their home. He was at Harlan Greer's property 2 nights ago. Harlan's a veteran. He's 78 years old. He lives out on Sutter Road. His heat went out. Dad drove out there after closing and worked till midnight fixing his generator. "Call him. Just call him." "We'll look into every lead," Grant said. "Don't look into it," Madison said. "Call him right now. It takes 30 seconds. Grant met her eyes. He looked at her the way a man looks when he knows someone is telling the truth and knows it doesn't change what he has to do in the next 60 seconds. "We'll follow up on everything, Miss Maddox." "That's not good enough." Her voice cracked at the edge. He was 40 miles away. He was helping someone. "That truck wasn't there when I left for my shift at 8 last night. I drove right past that spot. I would have seen it. I always looked, the gate was open, and there was nothing there." "Miss Maddox." Grant's voice was firm but not unkind. "We will follow up. I need you to stay on the property." Cal looked at his daughter over his shoulder as the deputy opened the patrol car door. The rain was coming down harder now, plastering Madison's hair against her face, and she was looking at him with an expression he recognized from the worst moments of her childhood, the look that came right before she decided she was going to hold herself together by sheer force of will. "Don't fight them, Maddie," he said, and his voice was the steadiest thing on that road. "Find out who needed me gone." The car door closed. Lena Ortiz was the last one to her vehicle. She was standing near the rear corner of the garage, where the gravel gave way to a patch of exposed earth and packed mud, and she was looking at the ground with her phone flashlight turned on, even though the morning was growing lighter by the minute. She crouched down slowly. The tire impressions behind the garage were deep, clean-edged. The kind of impressions you get when a vehicle drives through wet, freshly saturated ground. She looked at the tracks, then at the standing puddles beside them, then back at the tracks. Rain had pooled in the low spots all around the garage on both sides, in the gravel, along the fence line. Every low spot showed water. The tire impressions behind the garage showed no water. The rain had not yet had time to collect in them. Lena stood up slowly. The official report from the initial discovery team stated the truck had been spotted at 4:18 a.m., more than 2.5 hours before this arrest. The rain had started at 3:45. If the truck had been parked there before the arrest team arrived, the tracks should have been filling with water for hours. They looked like they'd been made within the last 45 minutes. She looked up and found that everyone else was already moving back toward the vehicles. The arrest was done. The warrant was served. The neighbors were still filming. Lena Ortiz took 4 photographs of the tire tracks with her phone. Then she got in her vehicle and said nothing to anyone, because she didn't yet know what she was looking at, but she knew she was looking at something. Inside the first patrol car, Cal sat behind the dividing screen and watched his home disappear through the rain-blurred rear window. Madison was still standing in the yard. She hadn't moved. She was watching the convoy pull away with her arms crossed tight against her chest. And even through the rain and the distance, he could see that she was already thinking, already calculating, already deciding what she was going to do next. He felt the specific ache of knowing your child is going to fight for you in a world that is not currently arranged in your favor, and of loving her for it, and of being genuinely afraid of what that fight might cost her. The charge they'd read him didn't make sense, not the particulars. He knew what he'd been doing 2 nights ago, every minute of it. Harlan Greer's generator had needed a full inducer motor replacement, which wasn't a job you could rush, and Cal had been on his knees on that cold linoleum floor until well past 11, with Harlan sitting nearby in his recliner, talking about Korea, not because he needed company, but because 78 years of living alone had made talking aloud a way of staying real. Cal had driven home on Sutter Road and Route 9 at 11:45, and he'd checked the gate out of habit because Madison had mentioned the latch was stiff, and there had been nothing behind the garage, Just the empty gravel and the dark. Somebody had put that truck there in the hours between then and the arrest. Somebody who knew it would be found. Somebody who had made the call to the tip line themselves. He ran it back through his mind the way a mechanic runs a diagnostic systematically, without assumption, following the chain of cause and effect. Who knew the layout of his property well enough to use the rear access gate? Who had a reason to need him out of the way specifically now? Who stood to benefit from the arrest happening fast enough that the evidence couldn't be examined too closely? 3 weeks ago, Dale Rourke's logistic coordinator had called the shop, asked Cal to sign off on 3 heavy-duty inspections. Cal had put the trucks on the lift, one by one, and worked through the inspection the way he always did, completely. Because his signature meant something. Because a truck that passed Cal Maddox's inspection actually passed. He'd found brake irregularities on one, a cracked CV joint on another, and a modified chassis rating on the third that didn't match the vehicle's registration. He'd refused to sign. The coordinator had called back twice. The second call, he'd stopped being polite. Do you understand how much business Rourke Logistics sends your way? Do you understand what it means to have the commissioner behind you or against you? Cal had said, I understand what my signature means. Call me when the trucks are fixed. They hadn't called back. He sat with that now, in the back of the patrol car, in the rain, and he turned it over and looked at all the edges of it. Whoever had set this up had done it thoroughly. The truck, the anonymous tip, the footage, fingerprints that he had no doubt would turn out to match his. The whole structure of it was too detailed to be improvised. This had been planned for long enough that someone had gathered those elements deliberately. Someone with access to evidence. Someone with connections inside the department. He thought about the brake job he'd done 8 months ago on a black pickup. He thought about the owner's name on the work order. He thought about the fact that his fingerprints were now in the system from that job. He thought about how easy it would have been for someone who knew that to engineer exactly what had happened this morning. His jaw tightened. The patrol car turned onto the county road toward Briar Ridge Municipal, and Cal faced forward in the hard plastic seat and allowed himself to really feel not fear, not anger exactly, but the cold and steady fury of a man who has been careful and honest and square for 16 years and who has just watched someone use that carefulness against him. He breathed through it, set it aside, because the fury wouldn't help Madison. And right now, Madison was the only thing that mattered. At the booking desk at Briar Ridge Municipal, they photographed him and took his belt and his boots and the contents of his pockets. They let him keep his vest, which was unusual. But Grant Holloway had specifically noted on the intake form that the vest was personal property with no evidentiary value, and the desk officer hadn't argued. The officer who processed him was young mid-20s, working with the careful precision of someone who understood they were being watched during their probationary period. He didn't make eye contact. He read everything from the form. Is there anything you want to disclose before we complete intake? I'm innocent, Cal said. Not with heat. Just as a statement of fact. The officer wrote something down. Whether he wrote claims innocence or just no disclosures was impossible to tell. In the interview room, 40 minutes later, Grant Holloway sat across from him without his deputies. He had the file in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking at Cal with an expression that had none of the practiced authority of the arrest scene, an expression that looked, for the first time, like what it actually was, the face of a man sorting through what he thought he knew against what he was beginning to suspect he didn't. Tell me about Harlan Greer, Grant said. 78 years old. Korea vet. Leaves alone on Sutter Road. His generator inducer motor blew out on Saturday. I went out Monday after close, that's 3 days ago. I worked till about 11:15, maybe 11:30. I drove home on Route 9. I checked the rear gate when I came in because my daughter said the latch was stiff. The space behind the garage was empty. Cal kept his voice even and clear. No elaboration beyond what was asked. Harlan can corroborate everything up to the time I left his property. He lives alone. No security cameras. No cameras, Cal said. Just his word and mine. Grant looked at him for a long moment. People will say a 78-year-old man would say whatever he thought would help you. People can say whatever they want, Cal said. You asked me for the truth. I gave you the truth. What you do with it is your job. Grant tapped the file. The footage from the warehouse puts a large blond man in a Hells Angels vest within 2 blocks of the loading area. The vest I've worn every day for 16 years. It appears to be consistent. Show me. Grant slid a printed still across the table. The image was grainy parking lot security camera, nighttime, compressed digital quality. A large figure in dark clothing and a leather vest, partially turned away from the camera, moving toward the side of the frame. Cal looked at it for a long time. I can see it's a man in a vest. I can't see a face, can you? Grant said nothing. Does that man favor one leg? Cal asked. Grant looked at the image. Hard to tell. I've been favoring my left since I blew out the knee in 2019. Nerve damage. I shift my weight consistently. Anyone who's seen me walk knows it. He slid the print back across the table. Check the video. Frame by frame if you have to. That man doesn't walk like me. Grant picked up the print and looked at it again. He set it down face up on the table between them and left his eyes on it for a long moment. The way a man looks at something when he stopped performing certainty and started actually thinking. The tire tracks behind my garage, Cal said. I want you to check them. Grant looked up. They put that truck there after the rain started, Cal said. I don't know when exactly, but the tracks should tell you. And if the tracks are fresher than your report says the truck was found, then the discovery timeline doesn't hold, Grant said. Not a question. The quiet statement of a man following a chain of reasoning to its destination. Who processed the initial tip? Cal asked. Grant's jaw tightened slightly. I'm not asking you to tell me things you can't tell me. I'm asking you to check things you probably should have been asked to check already. Cal folded his hands on the table. I'm not trying to do your job for you. I'm asking you to do it. The silence in the room stretched. Then Grant said very quietly, the patch. Cal waited. You didn't put your name on it, Grant said. You put your initials, and you didn't tell anyone who you were. There was a man who died that day, Cal said. Volunteer named Rios. He went into the north section, and the fire moved faster than the forecast. He had 4 kids. He stopped for a moment. I wasn't willing to be anyone's hero on the same day that man's children lost their father. So I left before anyone started looking for names. Grant sat with that. He looked at the man across the table, the large, calloused, quiet man who had walked into a burning bus and walked out carrying his 14-year-old son, and then gone back in because there were still people unaccounted for, and he felt the full mass of 17 years of the wrong picture press against the truth of what he was seeing now. I'm going to look at everything, Grant said. I want you to understand that this process is going to take time, and the warrant is valid. And I can't understand, Cal said. Do your job. Do it right. He paused. That's all I've ever asked of anybody. Grant stood. He gathered his file. He was at the door when Cal spoke again, not loudly, just clearly. My daughter's not safe right now. Whatever this is, whoever put that truck there, they didn't do it just to get rid of me. They did it because something is connected to the shop. The ledgers. The records. Something I touched. He looked at Grant steadily. She's going to start asking questions. She won't be able to help it. Make sure somebody's watching out for her. Grant looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and opened the door and walked out into the corridor where his deputy was waiting. Lena Ortiz was already back at the garage by the time Grant reached his office. She had her photographs loaded onto her laptop, and she had requested the original discovery report from the overnight duty log. She had pulled the timestamp from the report, and she had cross-referenced it with the Briar Ridge Weather Service data for precipitation start times. The rain had begun at 3:47 a.m. The truck was reported discovered at 4:18 a.m. The tire tracks in the photographs she'd taken showed no water collection in the impressions. She'd sent the photos to a colleague in the state lab, a friend, someone she trusted, someone outside the chain of command, and asked for an informal opinion on how long those tracks had been there. The reply came back in 20 minutes. Based on soil saturation rates and the precipitation data she'd included, those tracks were likely made no more than 30 to 60 minutes before the photographs were taken. The photographs were taken at 7:34 a.m. Lena sat at her desk and looked at the money, and felt the unease that had been sitting below her sternum since the early morning briefing grow into something cold and specific and heavy. The truck had been there for less than an hour before Cal Maddox was arrested. Maybe less. Someone had put it there after the arrest team was already en route. She looked at the door to Chief Deputy Pierce's office. The blinds were closed. Through the frosted glass panel, she could see his silhouette. He was on the phone, the receiver pressed close. His posture, the specific stillness of a man who does not want his body language read. She picked up her phone. She thought for a moment about who to call. Then she called the one person she trusted completely, who was completely outside the department, who would understand what she was looking at without her having to explain it. She called Madison Maddox. Outside the station, on the sidewalk, with the rain finally beginning to ease, 12 Hells Angels motorcycles sat in a line, engines off, riders standing alongside them in the morning light, vests and rain gear and faces that said they had every right to be exactly where they were and intended to stay there until something changed. Bear Callahan stood at the front. He was Cal's oldest friend in the club, a man who looked exactly like his name, broad and dark-bearded, with 23 years of Hells Angels membership and the specific, measured authority of someone who had learned through experience that power is most effective when it's visibly held in check. A young deputy came to the station door and looked at the line of bikes. "You need to move these vehicles. This is a restricted. These vehicles are parked legally on a public road," Bear said. His voice was even. "We are not blocking access. We are not creating a disturbance. We are standing on a public sidewalk." He looked at the deputy steadily. "If there's a law we're breaking, write me the ticket." The deputy went back inside. Bear turned to the men behind him. 20 faces, some angry, some frightened, some wearing the hard, expressionless look that meant they were keeping a short lid on something that wanted to come out. All of them waiting. "I need everyone to hear me," Bear said. Not loud. Low enough that it stayed within the group. "Cal didn't do what they're saying. Every one of us knows that. But we are not going to prove it by putting one of us through a window or saying something stupid on camera." He looked down the line. "This only ends the way Cal would want it to end if we handle ourselves the way Cal handles himself. Every minute we stand here calm is a minute that makes the people inside that building nervous. Calm is more powerful than angry right now. You understand me?" Nobody argued. Several of them nodded. "We protect Cal by finding the truth," Bear said. "Anything else, we're just helping whoever did this." Across the street, a television news van was pulling in. Bear watched it park. Watched the reporter climb out and look toward the line of motorcycles with an expression that was already assembling itself into a narrative. He didn't move. He stood with his arms loose at his sides and his face giving away nothing. And he waited. Because Cal had asked him to find out who needed him gone, and the first step in finding that out was staying exactly where he was and watching everything that happened next. Inside the patrol car, inside that building, in whatever room they'd put him in, Cal was doing the same thing, watching, thinking, waiting for the truth to show itself, the way truth always eventually does, to anyone patient enough to stop reacting and start paying attention. Madison didn't cry after the convoy left. She stood in the yard until the last vehicle disappeared around the bend on Route 9. And then she went inside, changed out of her nursing scrubs, made a pot of coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with her father's words running on a loop in her head. "Find out who needed me gone. Not prove I'm innocent. Not call a lawyer or call the club or don't do anything stupid." He'd told her to look, to think, to trace the shape of whatever had been built against him and figure out who had the reason and the resources to build it. She knew her father. She knew what that meant. It meant he already had a theory, and he didn't want to say it out loud in front of 5 deputies and a camera phone, and he trusted her to arrive at it herself. She pulled her laptop to the center of the table and opened a document and stared at the blank page for 30 seconds. Then she started writing everything she could remember. Every name, every date, every conversation her father had mentioned in the past 6 weeks. Not to organize it yet, just to get it out of her head and into a shape she could look at. Her phone rang at 8:14 a.m. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered it because she was answering everything now. Miss Maddox. A woman's voice, measured, careful. The voice of someone choosing each word before saying it. My name is Deputy Lena Ortiz. I was at your property this morning. Madison went still. I remember you. I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you this as an individual, not as a representative of the department, and that this conversation is not official in any capacity. A pause. The tire tracks behind your garage, the ones from the stolen pickup, I photographed them this morning before we left. The rain started at 3:47 a.m. The truck was supposedly found at 4:18 a.m. But those tracks had no water in them when I photographed them at 7:34. Madison's hand tightened around the phone. Someone put that truck there after your father was already in custody, Lena said, or just before the arrest team arrived. Either way, the discovery timeline in the official report doesn't match what the ground was telling me. You're a deputy, Madison said carefully. Why are you calling me? A beat of silence. Because your father's prints are on that truck, and when the lab confirms them, which they will, that's going to feel like the case is closed. And it's not. It's not even close to closed. Another pause. Longer. He told you to find out who needed him gone. I think you should listen to him. The line went quiet for a moment. Madison pressed her back against the chair and breathed slowly. Thank you, she said. I mean it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Lena said. Be careful. Don't go anywhere alone if you can avoid it. And if you find something, anything, don't sit on it. She hung up. Madison set the phone face down on the table and looked at the ceiling. Then she looked back at the blank document on her laptop screen and started typing faster. Rachel Monroe's office was 12 minutes from the Maddox property if you took the back road. Madison was there in 9. Rachel was 61 years old, sharp as anything still manufactured, and she'd been Cal's attorney of record since a county zoning dispute 8 years prior that she'd won so comprehensively that the opposing attorney had sent her a fruit basket as an apparent act of surrender. She'd already heard about the arrest news, traveled at a specific velocity in Briar Ridge, and she had coffee ready and a yellow notepad on her desk, and the expression of a woman who had already begun constructing her first counter-argument before her client's daughter was through the door. Tell me everything, Rachel said. Start with the truck. Madison told her everything. The tire tracks, the timing, the conversation with Deputy Ortiz, the inspection refusals 3 weeks prior, Rourke logistics, the coordinator's call, the pressure, the threats Cal had mentioned almost in passing because he didn't think they'd actually lead anywhere. Rachel wrote without stopping. When Madison finished, Rachel put the pen down and looked at her notes, and then looked at Madison with the specific focus of someone assembling a legal architecture in real time. The inspection refusals are significant, Rachel said. If Cal refused to sign off on Rourke's trucks, and one of those trucks was involved in the warehouse robbery, then your father becomes a liability, not just inconvenient, actively dangerous, because his refusal created a paper record. His signed refusal exists in his own ledgers, and his ledgers are what someone would want, Madison said. Rachel looked at her. Has anyone been to the house since the arrest? No. I came straight here. Go back right now. Before anyone else does, Rachel was already standing. Get the ledgers, the computer, anything with his work records on it, and bring it here to my office. You do not leave it in that house. Madison was already at the door. How fast can you file for an evidentiary challenge on the tire tracks? I can have the motion drafted by this afternoon, Rachel said, but I need that independent documentation from Ortiz photos. Can you get it to me without going through the department? I'll figure it out, Madison said. And she's already in the hallway. She drove home with both hands tight on the wheel. Going through the timeline in her mind, Rourke Logistics, 3 trucks with problems. One of them with a modified chassis rating that didn't match its registration. A coordinator who'd called twice and escalated fast. A stolen black pickup connected to an armed robbery. Her father's prints on a truck he'd serviced 8 months ago. An anonymous tip that included the exact location of the stolen vehicle, down to which side of the garage it was parked on. That last detail hadn't registered fully when Lena had spoken, but it landed now with a specific weight. The tip hadn't said behind Cal Maddox's garage. The tip had said northwest corner of the structure, behind the rear access gate. That specificity meant someone who knew the property, or someone who had been there recently enough to know exactly where to put the truck for maximum impact. She pulled into the yard and was out of the car before it fully stopped. She went through the side door into the shop, straight to her father's office, the cramped back room with the metal desk and the ancient filing cabinet and the laptop he used exclusively for work records and customer invoicing. She pulled the filing cabinet open and started lifting out the ledger books. 2 years' worth, heavy cloth-covered records Cal kept because he didn't trust digital records to be unhackable and believed that anything worth documenting was worth documenting twice. The laptop was under the desk, connected to the power strip. She pulled it out and set it on the desk and opened it and typed in the password her birthday, same as it had been since he got the machine, and waited for it to boot. She was looking at the screen when she heard the side door open behind her. She turned fast. Bear Callahan filled the doorway. He was alone, which surprised her. She'd assumed he'd be at the station. "Rachel Monroe called me," he said. "Said you'd be here and you shouldn't be here alone." He looked at the ledgers stacked on the desk, at the open laptop. "Smart girl." He looked at her directly. "What do you need?" "Help loading this into my car," she said. "And you need to tell me everything you know about Rourke Logistics." Bear didn't hesitate. "Dale Rourke's been trying to buy this property for 2 years. Cal said no 3 times, didn't even negotiate. The yard backs up to the old rail depot, which Rourke wants for his distribution operation. Without this property, his trucks can't access the depot loading platform directly. He needs this land and Cal won't move." Madison stared at him. "Dad never told me that." "Cal doesn't tell people things that worry him," Bear said. "That's his worst quality, and it hasn't changed in 20 years. He said it without rancor, the way you say true things about someone you've known long enough to love and be frustrated by in equal measure. So Rourke has a motive to remove Dad from the property and discredit him personally," Madison said. "If Dad's convicted, or even if the charges just stick long enough, the garage loses its license. The property could be seized on debt if the business goes under. And Rourke moves in," Bear said. "I know. I've been thinking about it since the arrest." She turned back to the laptop. She opened the work records folder and scrolled back 3 weeks to the Rourke Logistics inspection entries. 3 separate records, 3 vehicles, each one with Cal's typed notes on the specific failures, brake irregularities, cracked CV joint, modified chassis rating with registration discrepancy. Each one with a stamped failed inspection and Cal's signature in the scanned copy. She pulled up the 3rd record and looked at the modified chassis entry and the registration number beside it. She cross-referenced the registration in the county vehicle database, which was public record and accessible online. The vehicle was registered to Rourke Logistics, standard commercial registration, but the modification notes in Cal's inspection record described a chassis reinforced well beyond commercial weight specifications, the kind of modification typically associated with carrying loads that weren't supposed to be on the manifest. She photographed the screen with her phone. Then she emailed the files to Rachel Monroe's office address and to her own personal account and to a cloud storage folder she created on the spot with a password she hadn't used for anything else. She was closing the laptop when her phone buzzed. "Unknown number," she answered. Static, then a voice she didn't recognize, male. Older, slightly rough at the edges. "Miss Maddox?" "Speaking. My name is Harlan Greer." A pause. "I heard what happened this morning. I've been trying to call your father's phone, but it goes to voicemail." Her throat tightened. He's been arrested, Mr. Greer. He can't take calls right now. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Lord, Harlan said. Lord, no, he was here. Monday night, right up till nearly midnight. He fixed my generator, sat here talking with me, drove out the lane at 11:30. I watched his taillights go. You'd be willing to testify to that? I'm 78 years old and I've got nothing left to lie about, Harlan said. You tell me where to show up and I'll be there. On a walker if I have to be. Madison pressed her free hand against her eyes for a moment. Thank you, she said. I'm going to give your number to his attorney. Her name is Rachel Monroe. She'll call you today. You tell him. Harlan started and then stopped. You just tell him I know he didn't do anything wrong. And you tell him Harlan says thank you for coming out that night and for not charging me, which I already know he didn't. And don't try to tell me he did. I'll tell him, she said. She hung up and looked at Bear. We have a witness. 78-year-old veteran. No cameras, but his word is solid. It's a start, Bear said. It's not enough on its own, Madison said. We need the rest of it. We need to show why Rourke needed him out of the way. And we need to show how the truck got there. She looked at him. Who inside the department would have access to the arrest planning? Who would have known the team was going out that morning and roughly what time they were leaving? Bear was quiet for a moment. Then, you're asking who inside helped set this up. I'm asking who could have communicated the arrival window to whoever put that truck there, Madison said. Because the timing is too precise. Someone knew when the team was leaving, knew what route they'd take, and put that truck in place with just enough time to spare. Bear looked at her with an expression that was equal parts respect and concern. That's a serious accusation. I know, she said. I'm not making it yet. I'm following the logic. She picked up the first ledger. Help me get these to Rachel's office. And then I need to talk to whoever serves as club counsel because something tells me this is going to need more than one lawyer before it's done. At the station, Grant Holloway had closed his office door and was sitting at his desk with the arrest file open in front of him and a singular deep discomfort sitting across his shoulders that he recognized as the feeling he got when a case stopped adding up. He spread the documents across his desk the way a physician spreads film systematically, looking for what didn't belong. The anonymous tip had come in at 3:58 a.m. Monday. The tip line recording put it at a payphone on Mercer Street, which was 2 blocks from Rourke Logistics' downtown administrative office. Not impossible as a coincidence. Not comfortable either. The footage from the warehouse was time-stamped 9:47 p.m. the previous Tuesday. The suspect appeared for 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the figure moved from the edge of the frame toward a side door, partially turned, and then was out of shot. The body was large, the vest was consistent, the face was never visible. Grant had watched it 4 times that morning, and he was becoming increasingly certain that what he was looking at was footage of someone who had been selected and positioned precisely because they would look. Like Cal Maddox from a security camera at 40 yards. He pulled up the evidence log. He found the entry for the stolen truck logged in at 4:31 a.m., the timestamp 14 minutes after the tip, which was fast, impressively fast, the kind of fast that happened when officers were already looking in the right place, or had been told in advance where to look. He scrolled down the log, found the alteration timestamp at the bottom, 4:54 a.m. 17 entries had been modified at 4:54, all related to the truck's chain of custody. The system recorded who had made the modification. The officer's decode was 2,247. Grant leaned forward. 2,247 was Chief Deputy Nolan Pierce. He sat very still. He and Pierce had worked together for 14 years. Pierce had been his deputy chief since Grant's second term. He was competent, steady, well regarded by the men. He was not a man Grant would have identified as a liability. He pulled Pierce's personnel file, reviewed his financials as far as the department records showed commendations, performance evaluations, no disciplinary history, no red flags, nothing. But the modification was there at 4:54 a.m., before the arrest, before anyone had been to the Maddox property. At 4:54 a.m., 17 entries in the evidence log related to a stolen pickup had been modified by Pierce's officer ID. Grant closed the file. He put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall. He had a decision to make. He could go to Pierce directly, which would alert him immediately. He could go to the county DA, which would take the case out of his hands entirely. Or he could request a state investigator, which was the cleanest move, the one that removed Grant himself from the center of a case that was already complicated by the fact that he had an undisclosed personal history with the primary suspect. He reached for his phone. He called the state investigator's office. While he was on hold, his office door opened without a knock. Pierce stood in the doorway. He looked at the files spread across Grant's desk, and something moved behind his eyes, quick and controlled, the kind of micro-expression that most people would miss. Grant did not miss it. "Reviewing the Maddox file?" Pierce asked. "Casual. The specific casual of a man who wants to know what you know." "Working through some timeline questions," Grant said. His voice gave away nothing. 22 years of law enforcement. "The forensics on the print should come back by end of day," Pierce said. "I imagine that'll clear things up." "I imagine it will," Grant said. Pierce looked at him for a moment, then he nodded and closed the door. Grant waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor. Then he spoke into the phone. "Yes, I'm still here. I need to request an independent review on an active arrest. I believe there may be evidence of internal department involvement in a possible wrongful case." In the holding area, Cal sat on the bench in the temporary cell and did what he'd been doing for the past 2 hours, running names and timelines through his head with the same methodical discipline he brought to engine diagnostics. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have access to his records. He had only what he knew, and what he knew was this: the 3 trucks, the inspection refusals, the coordinator's threat, the timing of the arrest, 4 in the morning, moving fast, contained, no room for him to make calls before booking. Whoever had engineered this had wanted speed over thoroughness. They'd wanted the warrant processed and the arrest made before the evidentiary details could be examined by anyone who was going to examine them carefully. That told him something important. The people who built this were afraid of scrutiny, which meant that if scrutiny arrived fast enough and from enough directions, the structure would start to show its cracks. He was thinking about the computer in his back office when the guard came to the cell door. "Monroe's here," the guard said. "You've got 30 minutes." Rachel Monroe sat across from him in the visitation room, with her notepad already full. She got straight to it, the way she always did, because Rachel Monroe had never once in her professional life opened a conversation with small talk when there was real work to do. "Your daughter has your ledgers and your laptop. They're secure. I've got copies." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Your prints are on that pickup. I'm going to assume they'll confirm that. Break job 8 months ago," Cal said. "Check the work order. Already, we pulled it from the copy your daughter photographed. Registered to a D. Varell, business address listed as a Rourke Logistics subsidiary." She looked at him steadily. "You worked on a truck tied to Rourke 8 months ago." "I work on a lot of trucks," Cal said. "I didn't know the connection." "I believe you," Rachel said. "The jury will need convincing. But here's the thing. If someone deliberately sourced a truck your prints were already on to use as the planted vehicle, that's not coincidence. That's planning. And planning is traceable." "The log alteration," Cal said. Rachel's eyes sharpened. "How do you know about that?" "I don't specifically. But someone moved fast to get that warrant processed. Someone made sure the evidence chain was packaged before anyone had time to look too close. That kind of packaging leaves marks." He leaned forward slightly. "Someone inside the department is running interference for Rourke." Rachel made a note. "Can you narrow it down?" "Someone who had access to the tip line response, the evidence processing chain, and the arrest planning. Someone senior enough to redirect the process without raising flags." He looked at her directly. "I'm not going to throw a name out without something behind it. But I'd look at the chain of custody on that evidence log very carefully." Rachel underlined something on her pad. "I have a motion ready on the tire track timing." If the independent lab confirms Ortiz's assessment, which it should, I can challenge the discovery timeline and the chain of evidence. That alone doesn't get the charges dropped, but it creates enough reasonable doubt about the integrity of the investigation that the DA is going to start getting nervous. What about Rourke? Cal asked. That's harder. Commercial corruption is harder to prove than planted evidence, and it requires connecting the inspection refusals to the robbery and the robbery to the frame-up. And all of that through a chain of documentation that I'm still building. She paused. But the chassis modification on the third truck, the one with the registration discrepancy, that's significant. If that truck was used in the robbery and it was modified beyond commercial spec, and your inspection record documents that in detail, then your record is the single most important piece of evidence in this case. She looked at him, which is exactly why someone wanted your ledgers and your computer. Cal went still. When? Your daughter got there in time, Rachel said. Everything's secure. She saw something move across his face, the fast, tightly controlled relief of a man who was not going to allow himself to visibly exhale in front of anyone, not even his lawyer. She's all right. She had Bear with her. He nodded, said nothing. She's also the one who found the Harlan Greer connection, Rachel said, not without some warmth. She moves fast. She always has, Cal said. Outside the station, the news van had been joined by a second one. The reporter from the first had done a stand-up in front of the line of motorcycles Hell's Angels descend on Briar Ridge Station, and it had made the midday local news cycle with footage that showed 12 bikes and 12 serious-faced riders and exactly none of the context. The Chiron read, accused bikers' associates gather as community demands answers. Bear watched it on someone's phone and felt the tight, specific fury of a man who understands that the narrative is running ahead of the facts and can't be stopped by anything as slow as the truth. He turned to the youngest rider in the group, a kid named Terrence, 27, still carrying the bright-edged anger of someone who hadn't yet learned when not to feel things openly. Terrence had been watching the news footage with his jaw set and his hands in his pockets and an expression that was moving toward a decision. Don't, Bear said. Terrence looked at him. I wasn't. Whatever you're thinking. Don't. Bear stepped in front of him, blocking his view of the news van. I know exactly what you're thinking because I thought it, too, at your age, in worse situations than this, and I'm here telling you I was wrong every time. He kept his voice low and even. That reporter needs 30 seconds of something she can use. One broken window, one shoved camera, and everything Cal is going through today becomes permanent. Rourke wins without even trying. Terrence looked at him. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something that listened. Cal's not in that building because someone is stronger than him, Bear said. He's in there because someone is sneakier than him, and that's a different problem that requires a different solution. He put a hand on the kid's shoulder briefly. You want to help him? Stay exactly where you are. Stay calm. Make them nervous by being nothing like what they expect. Terrence exhaled, looked away, didn't move. Bear turned back toward the station doors and thought about Madison and the ledgers and the inspection records and the chassis modification that Cal's own handwriting had documented 8 months ago without knowing what it would one day be worth. Inside the DA's office, on the third floor of the county building, Assistant Dia Maria Solis was looking at the Maddox arrest file with the increasingly uncomfortable expression of someone who has received a beautifully wrapped package and is beginning to suspect it might not contain what the label claims. The file was thorough, impressively thorough for something assembled this quickly. The tip, the footage, the prints, the witness. The connection to the warehouse robbery, it was all there. Stacked neatly, documented precisely. Almost too precisely for a 4A. A response call on a case that hadn't been officially assigned to the county DA's office until 6. She'd been a prosecutor for 19 years. She'd seen sloppy cases and tight cases that looked tight from the outside and fell apart the moment you touched them. This one had the texture of the latter. She pulled up the evidence log and found the modification timestamp at 4:54 M. An officer ID 2247. She looked up 2,247 in the Department Personnel Index. Read the name twice. She picked up her phone and called Grant Holloway directly. I'm looking at your evidence log, she said when he answered. I'm looking at a modification at 4:54 a.m. by a senior officer. And I'm looking at a case that was processed in less than 90 minutes at 4 in the morning with a level of documentary precision that, in my experience, indicates either extraordinary efficiency or advanced preparation. She paused. I need to know which one we're dealing with. So do I, Grant said. There was a silence on the line. Then Maria Solis said, I'm putting a hold on charges pending independent review. Don't let that get to Pierce before I'm ready. Understood, Grant said. He hung up and looked at his office door. Through the frosted glass panel, he could see Pierce's silhouette at his own desk down the corridor. The receiver pressed close, the posture still and careful. Grant stood up. He walked to his door. He put his hand on the handle and then stopped. Because he had to think about this precisely. Walking down that corridor and confronting Pierce directly would give him the opportunity to destroy anything he hadn't already destroyed. But keeping Pierce at his desk, unaware of what Grant now knew, was only viable for a narrow window of time. The state investigator was coming. The DA was holding charges. And somewhere outside this building, Madison Maddox was moving fast with documentation that was going to start closing gaps. Grant needed Pierce exactly where he was for exactly as long as it took. He took his hand off the door handle and went back to his desk and pulled up Pierce's departmental access log for the last 72 hours. He'd been accessing the Rourke Logistics case file, not the current robbery case, an older file. A theft report from 14 months ago, connected to the rail depot that had been closed without resolution. Pierce had accessed it 6 times in the last 3 days. And each time he'd accessed it, he'd made modifications to the access log itself, the digital equivalent of wiping your fingerprints. But not quite clean enough. And Grant sat back and looked at what 14 years of trust and shared work looked like when stripped down to its actual components. He'd known Nolan Pierce since before his second election. He'd trusted his judgment, defended his decisions to commissioners and mayors and community boards. He'd stood beside him at 3 funerals for officers they'd both served with. He'd invited him to Danny's college graduation. He thought about what Pierce had in the briefing that morning, with such precise certainty, about where the truck was and when it was found and what the footage showed, packaged, already decided, delivered fast enough to outrun questions. Grant felt something he recognized as grief, underneath the anger, alongside the obligation. He didn't have time for the grief right now. He filed it where he filed everything he didn't have time for. There was a drawer in the back of a man's mind that held all the things he'd process later after the work was done. He'd put Danny's mother's death in that drawer for 6 months before he opened it. He could put Nolan Pierce in there for the next 48 hours. He reached for his phone again. He called Madison Maddox. She answered on the first ring. I need you to come to the station, he said. Not the front. The side entrance on Callaway Street. Ask for me directly. Don't tell anyone else you're coming. A pause. Bring whatever you found at the garage. A beat of silence on her end. Then, 15 minutes. She hung up without asking why. Good instincts, Grant thought. The same instincts her father had. The kind that don't waste time on questions when the direction is already clear. He stood up, gathered the evidence log, the modification timestamp, and the access history he just pulled. He looked once more at Pierce's silhouette through the frosted glass. 14 years. 3 funerals. And the man had been moving money through a dead evidence file for God knows how long while they stood at the same desk every morning and drank the same bad coffee and called each other by first name. Grant felt the weight of it settle, and he carried it to the side door and let it sit heavy on him the way honest things do when you finally stop looking away from them. In the holding area, Cal was staring at the ceiling when the guard came to tell him his bail hearing had been moved to 2 p.m. He sat up, thought about what that meant. Someone had moved fast to get the hearing scheduled ahead of the usual queue. That meant either the DA's office was accelerating the case, which should have made him anxious, or someone was intervening on the schedule on his behalf. He thought about Rachel, about Madison and the files she'd pulled, about Grant Holloway's face in the interview room, the way the sheriff had sat with the facts and followed them somewhere he clearly hadn't expected to go. He thought about the patch inside his vest, about the fact that a piece of faded embroidery had made a man who was ready to close a case decide to look at it instead. Not because of the debt. Grant wasn't that kind of man. Cal had recognized that immediately. But because the patch had introduced a contradiction, a detail that didn't fit the narrative that had already been built, and for a man like Grant Holloway, a contradiction was not something that could be ignored. It was a thread. And once you pulled a thread, you had to follow it to its end, because anything less was not the job. The thread was being pulled now. From multiple directions, by multiple hands, in a town where the truth had been buried, under a case built with impressive craft and a specific, terrible urgency. But badly built things eventually show their weakness under pressure. Cal had known that since he was 19 years old and first put his hands inside a badly repaired engine and felt the thing that had been done wrong concealed under something that looked right on the surface. You could cover a crack. You could not eliminate it. He lay back on the bench and closed his eyes and thought about Madison riding the back roads in her car, moving fast, carrying the truth of what his shop's records showed, carrying the evidence that Rourke Logistics had tried to erase. And he felt the steady, grounded calm of a man who has done the right things and is prepared to wait for the world to catch up to that fact. Outside, Bear was still standing on the sidewalk when the news anchor's voice carried from a phone screen, "Community members are calling for a swift resolution as the Hells Angels Associates arrest raises fresh concerns about motorcycle gang activity in the Briar Ridge area." Bear turned away from the screen. He looked at the station doors. He thought about Cal on his knees in the mud that morning, the steadiness of him, the way he'd looked at Madison and found the exact words she needed instead of the ones his own anger might have reached for. He thought about what Cal had said years ago about the difference between strength and force. Strength knows when to hold still, Cal had told him. Force can't help but move. Bear had been holding still for 3 hours. The reporters were getting restless. The community was watching. The evidence was out there, moving through the hands of people who understood what it meant. He could feel the case starting to shift. Not breaking open yet, but the pressure building quietly underneath. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face giving away nothing. And he waited for whatever was coming next. Madison was halfway to the station's side entrance on Callaway Street when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She had too much moving in her head. Too many things she was trying to hold in order. But something made her pick up. Silence on the line for 2 full seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, with the specific flatness of someone reading from a script they've memorized so many times, it no longer sounds like reading. "Stop moving the records," the voice said. "Stop asking questions. Take your father's deal when it comes and let this be done. You keep pushing, and you won't like where it goes." The line cut. Madison stood on the sidewalk with her hand tight around the phone, and her heart hit hard against the inside of her chest. She stood there for exactly 4 seconds. Then she took a breath, dropped the phone in her pocket, and kept walking. Because that call told her something more useful than anything she'd found in the ledgers. It told her that someone was watching her movement today. Someone who knew she'd pulled the records from the garage, knew she'd been to Rachel Monroe's office, knew she was heading toward the station right now. Someone who had a communication line active enough to respond to her actions in near real time. That wasn't a random threat. That was a surveillance operation. She pushed through the side door on Callaway and asked for Grant Holloway by name and stood in the corridor with the files under her arm and the sound of that flat, empty voice still sitting in her ears like something she couldn't unhear. Grant came to meet her personally. He looked at her face and read it the way law enforcement reads faces efficiently and without commentary. "You got a call," he said. "How did you know?" Because you walked in looking like someone who had just decided to accelerate instead of stop. He held the door to a small conference room and waited for her to go through first. Sit down. Tell me exactly what they said. Word for word, she told him. Word for word. The way her father had taught her to relay information without editorializing, without emotional coloring, just the words and the sequence and the specific tone of the delivery. Grant wrote it down. He looked at what he'd written. Then he looked at her. You drove here directly from Monroe's office? Yes. Anyone follow you? I don't know. I wasn't watching for it. Start watching, Grant said. Not unkindly. Just factually. From this point forward, you don't go anywhere alone. Not the store, not the hospital, not your father's property. He held her gaze. I'm telling you this as an official precaution, not to frighten you. I'm already frightened, Madison said. That's not the issue. The issue is what I found in the records. She set the files on the table and opened the top one. Third inspection refusal. Chassis modification with registration discrepancy. Look at the registered weight specification versus what Dad documented in the actual inspection. The difference is significant enough to indicate load capacity for carrying cargo that doesn't appear on a commercial manifest, Grant said. He was already reading. His eyes moved fast down the page, the way a practiced reader's eyes move when they're not processing language but pattern. When did he do this inspection? 3 weeks before the arrest. Grant set the page down. He looked at the wall for a moment. When he looked back at her, he said, Dale Rourke has been in front of the county commission 4 times in the past year, requesting expansion permits for the rail depot. Every time, the argument included projected freight volume numbers that our county transportation office flagged as inconsistent with the registered capacity of his licensed fleet. Madison stared at him. You already knew something was off. We knew the numbers didn't match. We didn't have documentation of how the vehicles were actually modified. He tapped Cal's inspection record. This is the gap. He looked at her steadily. Your father's signature on this refusal is the single most dangerous document Rourke Logistics has been trying to eliminate, and your father didn't even know it. The room went quiet for a moment. Madison looked at the page. Cal's handwriting, neat, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who understood that what went on paper might one day need to speak for itself, detailed every mechanical failure, every specification discrepancy, every reason the truck had failed the inspection. It was thorough in the way that only someone with genuine professional standards is thorough. Not performative, just complete. He wrote it like he writes every inspection report, she said. I know, Grant said. He had no idea what he was documenting. No, but someone at Rourke Logistics did. Grant gathered the files and stood. I need to make copies of everything and get originals to the state investigator. I've already made the call investigator arrive tomorrow morning, but in the meantime, I'm moving all Maddox case materials to secured storage outside this building's chain of command. Madison looked at him sharply. Outside this building. Yes, because someone inside this building. Because I can't rule it out, Grant said, which was not a confirmation and was not a denial and was the most honest thing he could have said. She absorbed that. The evidence log modification, she said. Ortiz showed me the timestamp this morning. She didn't tell me the officer ID, but you know it. Grant looked at her for a long moment. Miss Maddox, I'm not asking you to confirm it, she said. I'm asking you to tell me whether the person who modified that log is still walking around this building right now. The silence was its own answer. Madison picked up her jacket. How long does my father stay in that cell? The bail hearing is at 2 p.m. Rachel Monroe has filed the motion on the tire track evidence. Given the state investigator's involvement, I expect conditions will be restrictive. He'll likely be released, but prohibited from the workshop and required to surrender his firearms. He paused. He'll be home by tonight, but the charges aren't dropped yet. That takes time. Time he doesn't have, she said. If whoever made that call to me is watching his property and planning a next move. She left through the Callaway door the same way she'd come in. But this time she looked at every car on the street and every doorway and every angle that gave a clear view of the route she'd just walked. The threat had made her faster. She refused to let it make her smaller. Grant stood in the empty conference room for a moment after she left. He looked at the copies of Cal's inspection records and thought about what it meant that a man's honest professional work done without any awareness of its strategic implications had become the instrument that might bring down a county commissioner. He thought about the patch in the lining of Cal's vest and the way that same quality of person do the work, do it right, don't look for credit, had been operating in Cal Maddox for as long as he'd been in Briar Ridge, maybe longer. He'd arrested that man on his knees in the mud and told himself it was about evidence. And it had been about evidence, but it had also been about the vest and the patch on the back and the mental file every law enforcement officer builds over years about what certain kinds of people do. He'd looked at Cal Maddox and seen the category before he'd seen the man. And someone had counted on exactly that. He went to find Pierce. Pierce was in his office, jacket on. The desk cleared in a way that looked organized, but felt to Grant like the desk of someone who had recently moved things he didn't want found. He looked up when Grant entered, and his expression was calibrated and neutral in the specific way of a man maintaining performance under pressure. "Bail hearing set for 2, Pierce said. "I know." Grant came in and closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the room rather than sitting, a positioning choice that made the conversation subtly different. "I'm requesting your case access credentials for the Maddox file." Pierce went very still, just for a beat. "Standard procedure would be to request that through—" "I'm not doing it through standard procedure," Grant said. "I'm asking you directly, right now, access credentials for the Maddox file and the Rourke logistics file that you pulled 6 times in the last 3 days." Something shifted behind Pierce's eyes. The performance cracked just slightly, just at the edges, like a windshield after the first impact, holding together but no longer entirely intact. "I was reviewing background on Rourke's logistics permits," Pierce said. "It's relevant to the arrest." "You accessed that file before the arrest," Grant said. "First access was 4 days ago. The arrest was this morning." Pierce said nothing. "Nolan." Grant's voice dropped. Quiet, the tone that wasn't anger and wasn't pleading and was something harder than either. "The log modification at 4:54 a.m. is on record. Your officer ID. 17 entries." He watched Pierce's face. "I've been sitting in my office for the last 2 hours, hoping I was going to find a reason that had nothing to do with what I think it has to do with." Pierce looked at the desk. He looked at his hands, folded on the surface in front of him. He looked at the window. He looked like a man standing on a surface that had just finished being solid. "He's going to take you down with him," Pierce said. His voice had changed. Quieter, rougher, the performance gone. "Rourke doesn't stop. Once you're in, once you've taken something from him, and I took something from him a long time ago, Grant, before I understood what I was taking, he doesn't let you out. He just keeps adding to what he's holding." Grant said nothing. He let the silence do the work. "The Maddox arrest wasn't my idea," Pierce said. "I want you to know that. I didn't pick Cal. Rourke's people picked Cal. They needed someone who would be believed fast, with a profile that made the arrest feel inevitable. And they came to me and told me what the evidence package was going to look like and asked me to make sure it processed clean." He stopped, swallowed. "I moved the log entries. I closed out the dispatch record on the depot sighting. I made sure the timeline held together." "And the driver report," Grant said. "The private security guard who saw the truck near Rourke's depot first, 2 hours before it appeared behind Cal's garage." Pierce's jaw tightened. Pierce closed that report. "Yes. There's an audio dispatch file. Ortiz found it." "I know Ortiz found it," Pierce said, with a kind of exhausted recognition that was almost not surprise. "She's good. Better than I gave her credit for." Grant pulled his chair away from the desk. He sat down across from Pierce, the way you sit when the conversation is no longer official and not yet concluded and you're trying to reach the real person underneath the uniform. "How long has he had you?" Pierce looked at the desk. 7 years. 7 years. Grant absorbed that. 7 years of working alongside this man every day. 7 years of mourning, briefings, and budget meetings and crime scenes, and officer funerals and birthday parties at the station. 7 years. He paid my daughter's medical bills when she had the cancer diagnosis, Pierce said, not as an excuse, not seeking sympathy, just as a fact that had the weight of something that had been kept in a closed space for a long time. Insurance had denied the treatment. Rourke's company paid it. $312,000. And then he owned me. Pierce pressed his fingers flat on the desk. She's in remission. She has 2 kids now. I made the choice, and I made it every day after that for 7 years, and I knew what it was, and I stopped. Grant sat with that. She would have died, Pierce said, without that treatment. I know, Grant said, and he meant it. He understood, in the terrible, specific way that a parent understands anything involving a child, exactly what Pierce had done and why he'd done it, and the fact that understanding it didn't change what it was. And now I need you to sign a formal statement. Before you leave this building, before you call anyone. He leaned forward. If you run, Nolan, Rourke's attorneys will make you the primary liability, and Cal Maddox stays charged. If you sign the statement, we have the chain of command that connects the frame-up to Rourke directly, and Cal walks. Pierce looked at him for a long time. His eyes were red at the edges. The specific redness of a man who is not going to cry and hasn't cried in a long time and is holding everything in the specific way of someone who chose to carry a thing alone and is now discovering that carrying it alone has a terminal weight. Get the paper, Pierce said. Grant reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded form. He set it on the desk in front of Pierce with a pen on top of it. He'd had it prepared for 2 hours because he'd known, when he saw the officer ID on the modification log, how this conversation was going to end. He'd known Pierce. And Pierce, under everything, under 7 years of choices that compounded into the morning, was still a man who had been a good deputy before he was a compromised one. Pierce picked up the pen. He looked at the form. His hand wasn't entirely steady. He signed. Grant took the form. He stood up. He said, I'm placing you on administrative suspension, pending investigation. I need your badge and your service weapon. Pierce took them off and set them on the desk without a word. Grant picked them up and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. He didn't turn around your daughter, he said. Is she all right? A pause. She's great, Pierce said very quietly. She runs a daycare. Grant opened the door and walked out. The state investigator arrived 6 hours ahead of schedule, not tomorrow morning, that evening. Because Grant had made the phone call with enough urgency and enough specificity that the duty officer on the other end had escalated it immediately. Her name was Claire Weston, 40-ish, with close-cropped hair and the specific no-ceremony efficiency of someone who had done this job long enough to skip the part where people pretend a situation is less serious than it is. She set up in the conference room where Madison had sat that morning. She had Pierce's signed statement, the evidence log with the modification timestamps, the tire track photographs, Lena Ortiz lab confirmation, Cal's inspection records, the dispatch audio of the depot sighting, and the financial records Grant pulled on Rourke Logistics County permit applications. She read through everything without comment. When she finished, she set the last document down and looked at Grant. Commissioner Rourke has been using this depot to move stolen commercial vehicles and cargo across 3 states, she said. It wasn't a question. Your deputy's been running interference for 7 years. And this morning you arrested the one private citizen whose professional records directly document the vehicle modifications connecting Rourke's fleet to the robbery. Yes, Grant said. And your honest assessment is that you would have processed this arrest without question if not for the patch in the vest. Grant looked at her directly. My honest assessment is that the evidence package was built to be convincing, and it was convincing, and I would have been less likely to question it if the arrest hadn't introduced a personal complication that forced me to look more carefully. He paused. Which is its own problem. The case should have been examined carefully regardless. Weston looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something on her pad. We're going to need Rourke in custody before he knows Pierce is signed. Once he understands the chain of evidence that's been assembled, He'll move. He'll start destroying records, moving assets, making calls. How fast can you move? I need 2 hours to get the warrants coordinated at the state level. Rourke's attorneys are going to fight it. So we need everything bulletproof before we serve. She looked at her watch. 2 hours. Keep this building quiet. 2 hours. Grant thought about what could happen in 2 hours if Rourke's network was still active. He thought about the threat call Madison had received. He thought about the fact that someone had been watching her movements today with enough surveillance to respond in near real time. He called Madison's cell. She answered on the second ring. I'm home. Bear's here. Stay there, Grant said. Lock up. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't recognize. I mean it. A pause. What's happening? We're close, Grant said. Give me 2 hours. He heard her breathing on the line. Then, is he getting out? He's out. The bail hearing went through at 2 o'clock. You should have gotten the call from Monroe. I did. I was asking if he's getting out for good. Grant looked at the conference room door, at the light through the frosted glass, where Weston was already on her phone, coordinating warrants. Yes, he said. If the next 2 hours go the way I think they're going to go. He hung up and went to stand at the end of the corridor and watch the clock. Cal had been home for 40 minutes by the time Grant made that call. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the bail conditions, paperwork in front of him, no workshop, no contact with listed witnesses, firearms surrendered, check-in every 48 hours and a cup of coffee Madison had made him that he hadn't touched. She was across the table, and Bear was at the counter, and the house had that specific, charged stillness of people who are waiting for the next thing to happen and are each privately calculating how close the next thing is. Tell me exactly what Monroe said, Cal said. She said the motion on the tire tracks is filed. The state investigator is already on site, and there's a hold on prosecution pending independent review, Madison said. She said sit tight and let the process work. That's not like Rachel to say sit tight. She said it like she meant it, Madison said. Like the thing that we needed to do had already been done and was working. Cal looked at the coffee. He picked it up finally and drank some of it. He set it down and looked at his daughter and at the lines of tiredness in her face, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on pure will since before sunrise, and he felt the full weight of what she'd carried today without being asked to carry it. You pulled the ledgers, he said, before anyone got there, and the computer, all backed up. 3 separate locations. She held his eyes. The inspection record for the third truck, the chassis modification grant, said it's the document. The one that explains everything. Cal sat with that for a moment. He thought about that inspection 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday, the kind of day that had seemed entirely ordinary in every respect. He'd put the truck on the lift and gone through it the way he went through everything. And the discrepancy in the chassis modification had been obvious once you put it on the lift and looked at the load distribution engineering. He'd written it up. He'd stamped it failed. He'd called the coordinator and told him to fix it and come back. He hadn't thought about it again. Because he did that kind of job 40 times a year. And the stakes, as far as he knew, were commercial compliance. Not a freight theft operation running across 3 states through a rail depot 50 yards from his back fence. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't know, Madison said. If I'd known what was actually moving through that depot, Dad, she said, and her voice was quiet and even, and carried the specific firmness of a person who has spent the day becoming 10 years older. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You did the inspection. You called it honestly. That's what your signature means. She paused. That's what your signature has always meant. That's why they needed to get rid of you. Cal looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Bear. Bear said, she's not wrong. She usually isn't, Cal said. The phone rang on the kitchen counter. Madison grabbed at Rachel Monroe. The state investigator has issued warrants, Rachel said, without preamble. Rourke Logistics, Dale Rourke personally, and 2 named co-conspirators I'm not able to share yet. This is about to move fast, and it's about to be public. I need all 3 of you to stay at the house until I tell you otherwise. Understood, Madison said. Cal's bail conditions are going to be modified. Given the Pierce confession, yes, I said Pierce confession. Don't ask me yet, and we're going to be in front of a judge first thing tomorrow to begin the formal charges dismissal. Rachel's voice was doing the thing it did when she was managing multiple active variables simultaneously faster, more clipped, each sentence a complete unit. How are you three holding up? Ask me again tomorrow, Madison said. Fair enough. Stay put. She hung up. Madison set the phone down, looked at her father, looked at Bear. Pierce confessed, she said. Bear let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Cal said nothing. He looked at the table. He thought about the kind of man who ends up making a choice like Pierce's, the catastrophic choice, made in a moment of impossible pressure. The daughter in a hospital bed, the bills mounting, the hand that reaches out from a direction you know is wrong because the right direction isn't available. He thought about how the years after that kind of choice work on a person, the daily cost of it, the weight of the deception accumulating, the moment when you've done so many wrong things to protect the first wrong thing that you can't see the person you used to be from where you're standing. He didn't excuse it. The man had nearly sent Cal to prison for something he didn't do. He'd put Madison in danger. He'd allowed a corrupt operation to run through a county he'd sworn to protect for 7 years. But Cal had done enough living to know that the line between who Pierce was and who any man might become under the same pressure was not as wide as people like to think. And that understanding, not forgiveness, not yet, maybe never fully, but understanding was part of what made the anger in him clean instead of corrosive. He picked up his coffee again. At Rourke Logistics' administrative office, Dale Rourke was on the phone with his attorney when the 3 state vehicles pulled into the parking lot. He saw them through the window. He kept the phone to his ear for another 4 seconds of processing what he was seeing and calculating his options and understanding. With the cold clarity of a man who has been several moves ahead for a long time, that he had finally arrived at a move he hadn't seen coming. They're here, he said into the phone. Don't say anything without me present, the attorney said. Don't answer questions. Don't. Rourke set the phone down on the desk. He looked at the window for another moment. Then he turned to his administrative coordinator, the same coordinator who had made the call to Cal's shop 3 weeks ago, the one who had told Cal to understand how much business Rourke Logistics sent his way. And he said, very quietly, shred the routing manifests. Now, all of them. The coordinator looked at him. The digital copies are all ready. The physical manifests. The ones in the depot office. Go. The coordinator was out the door at a run. Rourke turned back toward the window. Claire Weston was walking across the parking lot with 2 state officers flanking her and the specific unhurried pace of someone who has all the warrants she needs and nothing left to prove. She was looking directly at the window. He looked at the phone on his desk. He looked at the door. He looked at the window again. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thumb drive and palmed it. And then he was moving toward the back of the building, toward the loading corridor that connected the administrative wing to the depot warehouse. He was almost to the loading corridor door when it opened from the other side. 2 state officers stepped through. They'd come in through the depot entrance, which meant the warrants had covered both access points simultaneously. Rourke stopped. One of the officers said, Dale Rourke. I know who I am, Rourke said. Sir, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, vehicle theft, evidence tampering, public corruption, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. I know my rights, Rourke said. His voice was flat, stripped of everything that wasn't the bare fact of the situation. In the depot warehouse, the coordinator had not been fast enough. The physical manifests were in a floor safe they found 30 minutes later, and the digital records had been subpoenaed from the cloud server before Rourke had hung up the phone. The routing documentation traced a 3-state network, stolen commercial vehicles stripped and reshipped through the rail depot under modified chassis registrations. The loads manifested as legitimate freight on Rourke Logistics paperwork. 3 vehicles directly connected to the Decker warehouse robbery. 2 of them carrying Cal Maddox's failed inspection stamps and refusal signatures. At the Maddox house, Madison's phone lit up with Rachel Monroe's number. She answered before the first ring finished. "Turn on the county news," Rachel said, "and start breathing again." Madison turned on the television. The chyron was already running. County Commissioner Dale Rourke arrested. State investigators cite corruption, theft, conspiracy. The footage showed Rourke walking through the parking lot with officers on either side, his face composed in the blank way of a man who has decided that composure is the last thing he is left to manage. Bear said something under his breath that Madison chose not to hear clearly. Cal watched the television without expression for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands, the grease-stained, calloused, inspection-marked hands of a man who had spent his professional life putting his name on things that were true, and he turned them over once, slowly, and set them on the table. "It's not done yet," he said. "No," Madison agreed. "But it started." Bear reached over and put a hand briefly on Cal's shoulder. One of those gestures that has no language equivalent, the specific weight of it, doing the work that words would have done badly. At the station, Grant Holloway watched the news alert come across his computer. At the same moment, his desk phone rang. It was Lena Ortiz, calling from the depot site. "We found the dispatch audio," she said. Original, unedited. The private security guard's call from 2 hours before the truck appeared at Maddox's garage. The guard identified the vehicle by plate, location, and time parked at the North Access Road to Rourke's depot. Pierce closed that call manually and deleted the log, but the audio server keeps a parallel backup he didn't know about. Grant closed his eyes for a moment. "Good work, Ortiz. There's more." She paused. "The man who made the threat call to Madison Maddox this morning. We ran the burner number through the cell tower records. It pinged off the tower closest to Rourke's administrative office at 9:17 a.m. Someone in that building made that call after watching her leave Monroe's office on the street camera. Rourke or coordinator? Coordinator's phone records put him at the office. I'd say coordinator, but on Rourke's instruction." Another pause. "We've also got 3 separate residents from Route 9 who recorded the arrest this morning. One of them, reviewing their footage tonight, caught a vehicle partial plate, dark-colored van moving on the service road behind the Maddox property approximately 40 minutes before the arrest team arrived. The partial plate matches a vehicle registered to a Rourke Logistics subsidiary." Grant sat back in his chair. The whole architecture of it, the timing, the coordination, the multiple moving pieces managed with the kind of operational discipline that comes from years of practice, it laid itself out in his mind with the clarity of something that only needed all its parts present to become fully visible. The van, the truck, the planted evidence, the manufactured tip, the modified log, the deleted dispatch audio, the threat call timed to Madison's movements. Rourke had run this like a professional operation. Not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he'd had 7 years of Pierce managing the institutional blind spots, and he'd come to trust that the county system would accommodate whatever he needed if he knew which levers to pull. He hadn't counted on a tire track with no water in it. He hadn't counted on a deputy who looked at the ground before getting back in her vehicle. He hadn't counted on a daughter who pulled a laptop out of a shop office 20 minutes ahead of the people coming to take it. He hadn't counted on a man in a cell who stayed calm and told his daughter to find out who needed him gone, rather than spending the day being angry. And he hadn't counted on a patch. Grant reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the small framed mount. He kept there a personal item he should not have brought to work but had, weeks ago, in a moment of sentiment he'd never have admitted to publicly. The scorched volunteer patch from the Lost Creek evacuation road. The one his son Danny had pressed into his hands in the hospital. Saved from the ground near the bus, kept for 17 years as the only evidence of the man who had carried him out. He set it on the desk and looked at it. The initials G. H in hand-stitched thread. Gerald Harold. The name a man went by when he was 19 years old and volunteering at a wildfire and hadn't yet become the person everyone else would know him as. Grant thought about what it meant that the same quality in Cal Maddox that had made him walk into a burning bus, the specific, uncomplicating refusal to calculate whether the risk was worth it, before doing the right thing was the same quality that had made him stamp those inspection reports, failed, and put his name on the refusal and hand back the paperwork and say, "Call me when the trucks are fixed." No consideration of what it might cost him. Just the honest verdict. Just the signature on the thing that was true. And a man like Rourke had looked at that and decided the most efficient response was to make sure Cal Maddox was never in a position to put his name on anything again. Weston knocked on Grant's open office door. She looked at the patch on the desk but said nothing about it. "Rourke's booked," she said. "Coordinator is cooperating and providing names in the extended network. We're looking at 3 additional co-conspirators in the shipping chain. Federal freight fraud. Statutes are going to pick this up. I've already made the contact." She looked at him. "The Maddox charges need to go before a judge first thing tomorrow for formal dismissal. I'll have a full recommendation in writing tonight." "What does that take?" Grant asked. "My written endorsement, the Pierce confession, the tire track documentation, the dispatch audio, the inspection records, and the cell tower data on the threat call." She paused. "It's airtight. Any judge in this county sees this in the morning and the charges are gone by noon." Grant nodded. He looked at the patch. He thought about Cal sitting at his kitchen table right now, watching news footage of Rourke in handcuffs, saying, "It's not done yet," in the measured voice of a man who has learned not to exhale until the actual work is actually complete. "He's right," Grant said half to himself. Weston looked at him. "Sir?" "Nothing." He picked up the patch and looked at it one more time. Then he put it back in the desk drawer. "Get me the recommendation as soon as it's done. I want to be at that hearing myself." Weston left. Grant's office went quiet, except for the sound of the building settling around him, the ventilation, the distant footsteps of officers on the floor below, the ordinary institutional sounds of a place that had nearly allowed something very wrong to become permanent. His phone buzzed. A text from Danny, his son, who taught high school math and had 2 dogs and called every other Sunday and didn't know, had never been told the name of the man who carried him out of a burning bus when he was 14 years old. The text read, "Dad saw the news. The arrested mechanic isn't that near where you work. You okay?" Grant looked at the message for a long time. He typed back, "I'm okay. There's something I need to tell you sometime about a man named Cal Maddox. Not tonight, but soon." He sent it, set the phone face down on the desk. Down the corridor, the room where Pierce had been processed for administrative suspension was dark. The badge and service weapon were in Grant's safe. The signed confession was with Weston. And the Maddox case, which had been assembled with such operational precision in the hours before dawn, assembled to be irresistible, to be inevitable, to be the kind of thing that closes before anyone looks too closely, was coming apart at every seam. 1 recovered audio file, and 1 photographed tire track, and 1 daughter's refusal to stop moving at a time. In the kitchen of the house on the edge of Briar Ridge, Cal Maddox set down his coffee cup. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Bear. He looked at the bail conditions paperwork on the table in front of him with its list of restrictions that would, by this time tomorrow, be irrelevant. He was still a large, quiet man in a worn leather vest. He was still the same mechanic, the same father, the same Hells Angels member that the neighbors on Route 9 had filmed that morning, with the certainty of people who believed they already knew everything they needed to know. Nothing about him had changed. The world's willingness to look at him clearly was the thing that was changing. Slowly, at the pace that truth moves when it finally has enough evidence behind it to stop being arguable. It wasn't fast enough, and it wasn't clean, and it was going to leave marks that would take a long time to heal. He knew that. But it was moving, and that was enough for tonight. The charges were dismissed at 11:47 a.m. the following day, not at noon as Weston had estimated. Earlier, because the judge, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had been on the Briar Ridge County bench for 18 years and had seen enough manufactured cases in her career to recognize the texture of one before the second witness had finished testifying, read through the documentation package in 40 minutes flat, asked 3 questions, received 3 complete answers, and looked up from the paperwork with the expression of someone who has just watched a building she trusted reveal a crack in its foundation. "These charges are dismissed," Judge Hale said, "with prejudice. And I want a full court review of every case touched by Deputy Pierce's access credentials going back 5 years, filed on my desk within 30 days. Rachel Monroe was on her feet before the gavel landed. She turned to where Cal was, sitting beside her at the defense table, same leather vest. Same steady hands, the bail conditions, paperwork already legally nullified, and she said, quietly, but without any attempt to hide the satisfaction in it, "Done." Cal looked at the bench. He looked at the dismissal order being signed. He breathed once, slowly, through his nose. That was all. No fist in the air. No collapse of relief. No visible surge of emotion that the reporters in the gallery, and there were reporters, 6 of them, because the Rourke arrest the previous night had turned a local story into a regional one overnight, could take and package into the headline they were hoping for. Just a man at a table, receiving the confirmation of something he had known to be true from the first moment and had simply been waiting for the world to officially catch up to. Grant Holloway was sitting 3 rows back in the gallery. He was in full uniform, which was a deliberate choice. He'd thought about that on the drive over. He could have come in plain clothes, kept it informal, reduced the institutional visibility. He'd chosen the uniform because he believed that the department showing up in the room where it had done wrong was a different statement than the department staying away. Presence as accountability. It was uncomfortable. That was exactly the point. When the gavel came down, he looked at the back of Cal's head and thought about everything he'd have done differently if the case had crossed his desk without the patch. He was still thinking about it when Madison found him in the corridor outside the courtroom, moving through the press cluster with the specific, practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent the night deciding what she was and was not going to say to cameras that morning. She'd said nothing. She'd walked past every microphone with her eyes forward and her chin up, and the look of a woman who understood that whatever she said right now would be someone else's headline and not her own truth. She stopped in front of Grant. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said finally, not warmly, not coldly. Just honestly, the way you thank someone for doing a hard thing that cost them something. Grant said, "I arrested an innocent man." "You also uncovered why," she said. "And you did it when it would have been easier not to." She held his eyes. "I'm not saying you didn't make a mistake. You did. I'm saying what you did after matters too." Grant looked at her. He thought about what it took for that sentence to come out of her mouth, given the past 36 hours. He thought about what Cal had raised. "How is he?" Grant asked. "He's not sleeping," she said. "He's sitting at the kitchen table, going through everything he owns and trying to figure out what he missed. And the answer is nothing, and he can't accept that yet." "He didn't miss anything," Grant said. "I know that," she said. "He knows it too. He just hasn't caught up to knowing it yet." She shifted the folder she was carrying under her arm. "The garage is going to take time. His name is clean on paper now, but paper travels slower than rumor in this town." "I know," Grant said. "I'm not sure you do," she said, and her voice was even, but there was something behind it that had edges. "My father has lived in Briar Ridge for 16 years. He's fixed cars for half the people in this county. He's shown up when people needed him shown up for, and he's done it without making a performance of it. And yesterday morning, every one of those same people watched him get taken away in handcuffs and decided what meant before the car reached the end of the road." She paused. "The charges being dismissed doesn't erase that image. You know what erases that image?" "Time," Grant said. "Time," she agreed, "and something to replace it." She walked back toward her father, and Grant watched her go, and he thought about what he owed not to Cal personally, not as a matter of emotional debt, but as a matter of institutional responsibility to the process of making that replacement happen. The garage had been legally sealed during the investigation. The seal came off the same afternoon the charges were dismissed. Cal stood in the doorway of his own workshop for a long moment before he went inside, not hesitating. Exactly, but taking stock. acknowledging the strangeness of returning to an ordinary place after it had become the site of something extraordinary. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Harlan Greer's generator still partially dismantled on the main workbench. The work orders stacked in their tray. The tool wall organized the way he'd organized it 11 years ago when he first opened the shop. Every implement in its designated place. The system so deeply habitual he could work it in the dark. He pulled on his work gloves. He walked to the workbench. "You're not going to take even one day?" Bear said from the doorway behind him. "Harlan's been without heat for 4 days," Cal said. "It's October." Bear looked at him for a moment. Then he pulled up a stool and sat down. "What do you need?" "Inducer motors on the parts shelf." "Hand me the blue-handled torque wrench." Bear handed him the wrench. And that was the entirety of the conversation about everything that had happened. Because Cal Maddox had never processed trauma by talking about it at length, and Bear had known him long enough to understand that the way Cal processed things was by working, and the best thing a friend could do in that moment was hand him the right tool and not require him to perform recovery on a timeline that felt right to anyone but himself. 3 hours later, Cal drove 40 miles to Harlan Greer's property on Sutter Road, generator components in the truck bed, and finished the job. Harlan met him at the door. He was wearing a cardigan and holding a cup of coffee, and he looked at Cal with the particular expressiveness of a 78-year-old man who has been through enough of life to not bother with preamble. "I testified," Harlan said. "You should know. They put me on a video call with that state investigator woman, and I told her everything. What time you arrived, what time you left, what we talked about." He paused. "I told her about Korea too, but she didn't need that part." "Thank you." "Harlan." "Don't thank me for telling the truth," Harlan said, with a small heat in it. "That's not a favor, that's just what you do." He opened the door wider. "Come in and drink something hot while you work. It's cold in that utility room." Cal went in. He finished the generator by early evening. The heat came on. Harlan stood in the hallway and put his hand up near the ceiling vent and felt the warm air and said, "There it is," with the quiet satisfaction of a man for whom warmth in winter is not abstract but physical and necessary. Cal was packing his tools when Harlan said, "I heard what they wrote about you. Online, on the news." He paused. "People saying things like they knew." "They thought they knew," Cal said. "That's worse," Harlan said. "Knowing you're wrong is something you can work with. Thinking you know is a door that doesn't open from the outside." He looked at Cal steadily. "Give them time. The ones worth keeping will come around." Cal looked at the old man. Harlan had survived a war and outlived a wife and raised 3 children who now lived across the country and called on holidays and came home in summer, and he lived alone on a long road in a house that had been built by his own hands in 1974. And he spoke with the specific gravity of someone who has earned every syllable of what they say by living through everything it took to learn it. "The ones worth keeping," Cal repeated. "That's right," Harlan said. Cal drove home in the dark, thinking about that. The first week after the dismissal was the hardest, not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. The extraordinary events, the arrest, the warrants, the confession, the dismissal had compressed into a single 48-hour period that had the density and violence of a car accident, and then they were over, and what was left was the ordinary world, which had not yet adjusted itself to what it had just witnessed. 3 customers who had standing appointments didn't show. They didn't call to cancel. They simply didn't come. Cal noted it and said nothing and kept working, because the alternative was to make the empty appointment slots into something they hadn't yet decided to be. The online comments were worse. Not because they were threatening, the explicit threats had stopped when Rourke's arrest became public, but because of their specific character. "How do we really know he's innocent?" And the charges were dropped on a technicality. That's different from innocent, and I don't care what the court says. Where there's smoke, there's fire. The kind of comments that cannot be argued with because they have already decided that argument is a form of proof. Madison read them. She didn't tell her father about them, and she didn't show them to Bear, and she didn't post responses. She read them in the privacy of her own room, at 11 at night with her jaw tight and her hands quiet in her lap. And she let herself feel exactly how angry they made her for exactly 10 minutes. And then she closed the browser and went to bed. Because she had learned was learning, was still in the middle of learning that anger at people who are not yet ready to see clearly is a resource you have to spend and carefully, or it eats through you. She was on a 12-hour shift at the hospital 3 days after the dismissal when one of the attending physicians, a man named Dr. Reyes, who had worked alongside her for 8 months and whose opinion she respected, stopped her in the hallway between rooms. "Maddox," he said, "I need to say something." She stopped, looked at him. "I saw the arrest on someone's phone," he said, "Monday morning. And I said something in the break room." He held her eyes without looking away, which took something. "I said I don't remember exactly. Something like you never really know about people. And I meant it about your father. And I was wrong. I wanted to tell you that directly." Madison looked at him. She thought about the 10 minutes she allowed herself every night. She thought about what Harlan Greer had said about doors that don't open from the outside. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it directly." "Is he all right?" "He's working," she said. Reyes nodded. That was enough information. He went back to his rounds. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back to her patient. Grant Holloway requested a meeting with the Briar Ridge Town Council on the 8th day after the dismissal. He didn't ask for it through a liaison. He called the council chair himself directly, which was not the standard procedure and was precisely why he did it, because standard procedure had a way of softening things that needed to arrive with their full weight intact. He stood in front of 5 council members in the public meeting room in uniform with no notes and no prepared remarks, and he said, "I want to speak about the Maddox arrest, and I want to do it publicly because as I think the public deserves to hear it from me directly." He looked at each of them in turn. "I executed a warrant on a man whose evidence package had been manufactured by parties with a financial and criminal interest in removing him. The package was convincing. Some of the evidence was real, his prints on the vehicle, footage that could plausibly be read as implicating him, and it was assembled precisely to exploit the assumptions that a department like mine can develop over time about what certain kinds of people do." The council chair, a woman in her 60s named Bev Ashmore, said, "Are you saying the arrest was improper?" "I'm saying it was built to be executed by someone who would not look closely enough," Grant said. "And I didn't look closely enough initially. I looked more closely when something personal caused me to question what I was seeing. And that's the problem. The scrutiny should have been there from the beginning without the personal complication. It wasn't." He paused. "I'm here to tell you that and to tell you what we're changing." He laid out the procedural reforms he'd already begun implementing: mandatory independent corroboration of anonymous tips before high-risk arrests, automatic evidence log audits, required secondary review of all warrants involving prior relationship between the arresting officer and the suspect, and a bias review process built around the documentation of the Maddox case. "These aren't punishments," he said. "They're corrections. A department that can be used as a tool by someone like Rourke because its processes have gaps is a department that has failed its community. Closing those gaps is the job." Bev Ashmore looked at him for a long moment. "You're voluntarily reducing your own operational latitude." "I'm increasing my department's accountability," Grant said. "Those aren't the same thing, though I understand why they might look that way." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. The council approved all the proposed procedural changes unanimously, which surprised none of the reporters present, and surprised Grant not at all, because the only thing a political body moves faster on than its own interests is documented accountability from someone else. He drove from the council meeting to Cal's garage without calling ahead. Cal was under a truck when Grant arrived, visible only as a pair of boots and the sound of a socket wrench working a stubborn bolt. Bear was at the second lift with something apart on the workbench in front of him. 2 other riders were in the far bay doing a brake job on an older sedan. Grant stood in the open garage door, Bear saw him first and watched him with the specific careful neutrality of a man who has decided to let the situation play itself out before deciding what it is. Cal rolled out from under the truck. He looked up at Grant from the shop floor. He was covered in grease from the elbow down, a smear of it across one cheekbone, and he looked exactly like what he was. A mechanic who had been under a vehicle for the past 2 hours and had not stopped being that between the arrest and the dismissal, and now. He didn't say anything. He waited. I spoke to the town council this morning, Grant said. Everything I told them I wanted to tell you too, not as a follow-up. First, you spoke to the council first, Cal said. I did, Grant said. No apology, just acknowledgement. I should have spoken to you first. That's on me. Cal sat up. He pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands, the same gesture Grant had watched him make in the garage doorway 6 days ago. In the rain, just before the world came apart. What did you tell them? Cal asked. Grant told him. Everything he'd said to the council, the procedural reforms, the acknowledgement of how the evidence package had been designed to exploit departmental assumptions. He said it plainly, without the managed language of a prepared statement, because Cal Maddox was not a man you offered managed language to. He was a man you spoke to in the same register he spoke to you. Cal listened without interrupting. When Grant finished, he was quiet for a moment. The reforms are right, he said. I know. The bias training, you have to build it around specific cases, not general principles. General principles don't stick. People need to see what the actual failure looked like. That's what Weston said, Grant told him. And the case we're using is yours, with your permission. Cal looked at him. Something moved in his expression, not quite what Grant would have called surprise. But the close neighbor of it, the look of a man recalibrating what he'd expected to be offered against what was actually on the table. My permission, Cal said. You went through something because of how this department operates, Grant said. Using it as a teaching case without asking you would be another version of the same problem. Cal looked at the rag in his hands. He looked at the truck he'd been working under. He looked at Bear, who was still watching from the second lift with an expression that had moved from cautious to something more open. Yes, Cal said, use it. Grant nodded. He turned to go and then stopped. Because there was one more thing, and it was the hardest one. And he'd been telling himself for 6 days that it was personal and should stay private, and the professional obligations had already been discharged. He'd been wrong about that. Personal things had a public dimension when they'd shaped a public action. In the interview room, Grant said. He didn't turn around fully. He set it to the middle ground between himself and the garage. When I asked about the patch, you said there wasn't time to exchange names, that you left before anyone could find you. That's right, Cal said. My son is 31 years old, Grant said. He teaches math. He has no idea who carried him out of that bus. He paused. He asked me about you, after the news. He texted me saying he'd seen the story and asked if you were near where I work. Another pause. I told him there was something I needed to tell him. About a man named Cal Maddox. The garage was very quiet. The only sound was the distant ticking of a cooling engine. You don't have to do anything with that, Grant said. I'm not asking you for anything. I just thought you should know he's out there. And he's well, and he asked about you without knowing he was asking about you. Cal said nothing for a long moment. Then what's his name? Danny, Grant said. Cal looked at the floor. His expression did the thing it did when he was carrying something he hadn't decided how to put down yet. Danny, he said, like he was making it real by saying it. Yeah, Grant said. He left the garage. He sat in his patrol vehicle for a moment without starting the engine. He thought about what it cost a man to pull a secret out from where he'd kept it for 17 years and hand it to someone else. He thought about what it cost the other man to receive it. He started the engine and drove. That night, Madison found her father sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside him, and he had the look he got when he was thinking through something deeply not worried. Not troubled, just very far inside whatever it was. What? She said. He looked up. Grant told me about his son. She sat down across from him. She'd heard the detail during the case, but hadn't pressed on it. It had seemed like something that belonged to him. He said, "The son is 31, teaches math. Ask about me on the news without knowing it was me." Cal turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "His name is Danny. Are you going to reach out?" "I don't know," Cal said. I don't know what that looks like. I didn't do it to be owed anything. I didn't do it to be found." He paused. "I did it because he was a boy in a bus, and there was time, and now he's a man who doesn't know the name of the person who carried him," Madison said. Cal looked at her. "It's your choice," she said. "I'm not pushing either way. But you spent 17 years carrying that patch inside your vest because you didn't think you deserved to wear it on the outside. And now someone who has a reason to know your name is out there asking about you." She met his eyes. "What's it worth to you to stay hidden?" Cal looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at his daughter, who had grown up in the considerable shadow of a large, quiet father who kept his most important things private and had taught her, inadvertently, to be braver than he sometimes was about the things that mattered most. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. She got up and refilled his coffee. He accepted it. They sat together in the kitchen, in the quiet that isn't empty, but full, the kind of quiet that exists between two people who know each other well enough to be in the same room without filling all the space with words. On the 12th day after the dismissal, a Wednesday, Bear showed up at the garage at 7 in the morning with a proposal. "Open repair day," he said. "One Saturday. We open the yard to the public, free inspections for nurses, veterans, single parents, elderly. Club provides labor. We reach out to the parts suppliers for donations." Cal looked at him. "You think anyone will come?" "Some will," Bear said, "and some won't. And it doesn't matter which." "It does matter," Cal said. "If 3 people show up, it looks like an apology nobody accepted." "No," Bear said patiently. "It looks like 3 people got their cars fixed for free. That's what it is. Whether 10 people show up or 50, that's what it is." He looked at Cal steadily. "You're not doing it to be forgiven. You're doing it because it's useful. That's the only reason you've ever done anything." Cal was quiet for a moment. Bear had known him for 23 years and had the specific authority of someone who has watched you long enough to be able to tell you things about yourself that you can't see from the inside. "Madison's been thinking about it too," Bear added. Cal looked at him sharply. "Since when do you and Madison strategize without me?" "Since Monday," Bear said, without any visible guilt. "She's got ideas for the medical component. Emergency safety and basic health screening. She wants to run it in conjunction with the repairs." Cal looked at the garage. He looked at the empty bays that had been fuller a month ago. He looked at the work orders that were still coming in, not as many, not yet, but they hadn't stopped entirely. Because some people in this town had been using Maddox Automotive for long enough that a news story didn't override a decade of trust in a single day. "Set it up," Bear smiled. It was a rare thing. That smile, it changed his whole face. 2 Saturdays from now," Bear said. "I'll make the calls." Madison organized the medical component in 4 days because once she had a task with clear edges, she moved at a speed that was almost alarming to observe. She contacted 3 nursing colleagues, pulled together a basic screening kit from supplies the hospital's community outreach program approved for external events, and drafted a 1-page flyer that said nothing about the arrest or the dismissal or the vindication. It said, "Free vehicle inspections and health screenings. Open to nurses, veterans, single parents, and senior residents. Maddox Automotive, Saturday 9 a. 3 p.m. She put them up herself. In the laundromat and the diner and the hardware store and the community board outside the library. She put them in the hands of 3 nurses at the hospital who she knew had spoken badly about Cal in the break room after the arrest. Not to make a point, but because those 3 nurses had vehicles and needed inspections, and it was a free Saturday. The Saturday arrived gray and cool, the kind of Oregon October morning that carries winter in its edges. At 9 o'clock, there were 2 cars in the lot. Both belonged to riders from the club, positioned as props to make the yard look operational rather than empty. Bear leaned against the garage wall with his arms crossed and said nothing. Cal opened the hood of the nearest vehicle and started working. Because that was what you did. You did the work that was in front of you, and you let the rest be whatever it was going to be. At 9:20, a woman drove in with a minivan and 3 kids in the back seat. She was wearing scrubs and looked like she'd come straight from a night shift. She rolled down her window and looked at Cal with the cautious expression of someone who had talked herself into being here over the course of several days. "Is this the free inspection?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," Cal said. "Pull into the first bay. I'll get to you in about 10 minutes. She pulled in. At 9:45, a veteran arrived in a truck that was making a sound no truck should make. Cal put it on the lift and fixed the exhaust mount, replaced the heat shield, and had it back on the ground in under an hour. The veteran stood beside him the whole time, watching the work, and at the end he said, "I voted for Rourke in the last county commission election." Cal handed back his keys. "How's the truck sound?" The veteran listened. "Quiet." "Good," he said. "Come back if anything changes," Cal said. By 11, there were 14 vehicles in the yard, not 50. Not the kind of crowd that photographs well for a news story about community redemption. 14 people who needed their cars looked at and had decided, for whatever combination of reasons, to come to this particular yard on this particular Saturday. 3 of them apologized. Cal received it the way he received everything without performance, without making the other person feel either absolved or punished. At 11:15, Grant Holloway drove in. He was not in uniform. He was in jeans and a flannel jacket, and he was driving a bus, a full-sized evacuation bus, older, yellow, the kind that belonged to a youth program and which was running with the specific reluctance of a vehicle whose engine has been asked to do more than it has left to give. He parked it at the edge of the lot and walked to where Cal was working under the minivan. He waited until Cal rolled out. "That bus," Grant said, "youth outreach program. County can't fund the repair, and without a working bus, the program loses its route for the winter." He paused. "The engine's failing. I've been told it needs about 2 days of work." Cal looked at the bus. He looked at Grant. "That's the evacuation bus," he said. "Not a question." "Refurbished," Grant said. "Different paint. Same chassis." He held Cal's gaze. I checked. The recognition moved across Cal's face slowly, the way it does when something you've kept in a particular compartment for a long time gets suddenly, unexpectedly present. The bus, the one he'd run toward in the smoke, the one he'd gone back through after, the one he'd left before anyone could find his name. "It's been running a youth route for 8 years, Grant said, once they fixed the engine. Cal looked at the bus for a long time. Then he looked at the riders working in the bays, at Madison running the health screening table along the far wall, at the 14 people who had decided today to show up, at the whole ordinary, improbable fact of the yard being full of people doing useful things on a Saturday morning in October. "Pull it into the main bay," Cal said. "I'll look at it today." Grant pulled the bus into the bay. Cal followed it in, and several riders drifted over without being asked, because that was how it worked. When a big job came in, you moved toward the work because the work needed to be done and there were hands to do it. Grant walked to the edge of the bay and turned to face the yard. He stood there in his flannel jacket in the ordinary Saturday morning light, and he looked at the people who were in the yard and at the work being done, and he did something he almost never did in a professional context. He talked, not an announcement, not a prepared statement, just talking to the people nearby, the ones who could hear him in the voice of a man saying something he needed to say out loud. "I want to tell you something," he said, "about why that bus is here and about the man who just agreed to fix it." People stopped, not everyone, but the ones close enough to hear, they stopped and listened, because there was something in Grant Holloway's voice that morning that had none of the official register and all of the personal one, and that combination is impossible to ignore. He told them. Not the full story. The full story had years in it, and the full story would take years to properly tell. But enough. The evacuation road, the smoke, a 14-year-old boy who couldn't reach the door, a large blonde volunteer who went in running and came out carrying the boy and went back in again and was gone before anyone could find his name. a scorched patch on a road in the Lost Creek wilderness that Grant had kept for 17 years. The yard was very quiet. "I arrested this man," Grant said. "I did it with a warrant and a bad evidence package, and 16 years of assumptions I'd never examined. And when I found out I was wrong, it was because he made me look more carefully." He paused. Not because he was perfect, because he was honest. Because the work he did, the signatures he put on things, the choices he made quietly over 16 years, those things couldn't be made to disappear as easily as the people trying to destroy him thought they could. He looked at the bus in the main bay. At Cal's boots visible beneath it, already working. "The patch made me question what I thought I knew," Grant said. "His choices gave me the answer." The sentence landed in the quiet yard and stayed there. One of the three people who had apologized earlier was a woman named Carol, and had filmed the same road as the garage and posted it with a caption she'd deleted 2 days later when the truth came out. She was standing near the health screening table with her daughter's car keys in her hand and her face doing the complicated thing that faces do when they're in the middle of something that can't be undone but might, with effort, be made into something else. She walked to the main bay. She stood at the edge of it. "Can I help?" she said to the nearest rider. "I don't know engines, but I can hand things, hold things, whatever you need." The rider, a man named Dex, who had been with the Hells Angels for 11 years and had the patience of someone who'd been misread long enough to stop wasting energy on it, looked at her for a moment. Then he pointed to the creeper beside the lift. "Grab that and slide it over here," he said. "And I need someone to hold this bracket while I get the bolt started." Carol grabbed the creeper. She held the bracket. Inside the bus, Cal heard Grant's voice carrying through the open bay doors. He heard the story he'd kept inside a vest lining for 17 years being told in a parking lot to strangers who needed to hear it. He felt the specific complex discomfort of a private thing becoming public, not violated. Not quite, but exposed in a way he hadn't chosen and couldn't have predicted. He lay still for a moment under the bus. He looked up at the chassis. Then he thought about what Madison had said at the kitchen table in the quiet that was full. "What's it worth to you to stay hidden?" He reached up and got back to work. By 3 o'clock, 29 vehicles had been through the yard. The bus engine diagnosis was complete and the parts ordered. Madison's health screening table had seen 17 people, 2 of whom she referred directly to follow-up appointments with concerns she didn't feel comfortable dismissing. As people left, something that wasn't quite normal but was pointed in its direction settled over the yard. Not restored, not healed, not the version of community that exists in the telling of a story after the hard part is over. Just people who had shown up and had their cars looked at and had seen something they had been sure they were going to see: the ordinary, daily, unperformative fact of Cal Maddox doing useful work in the community he'd lived in for 16 years, the same way he'd always done it, without asking anyone to celebrate him for it. Cal locked the garage at 4:20 that afternoon. He stood in the empty yard for a moment. Bear came to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. 29, Bear said. 29, Cal said. Next time it'll be more. Maybe, Cal said. Definitely, Bear said. Cal looked at the bus parked in the main bay, visible through the open garage door. The youth program's logo on the side. The chassis that had survived a wildfire and 18 more years of Oregon roads, and now needed a new engine to keep running. He'd fix it. He'd have it running by end of next week. And then it would carry kids on its route through the winter. And most of them would never know any of the history in the chassis. And that was fine. The bus didn't need to carry the story. It just needed to carry the kids. He turned up his collar against the October evening and walked inside. The bus ran its first route of the winter on a Tuesday morning in early November, 3 weeks after Cal finished the engine rebuild. He knew because Grant texted him. Just 3 words: "She's running clean." And a photograph blurry, taken through a rain-streaked window, the yellow bus moving through the gray November morning on the county road outside Briar Ridge. Cal looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he set his phone face down on the workbench and went back to the transmission he'd been rebuilding since 6 that morning because that was all the acknowledgement the moment needed, and he knew it. What he didn't know, what nobody had told him yet, was what had happened 3 days earlier at the federal courthouse in Portland. Rachel Monroe called at noon. "Sit down," she said. "I'm already sitting," Cal said. He was on a stool at the workbench. It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. "Federal freight fraud charges have been added to Rourke's indictment," Rachel said. 3 states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho. 12 additional co-conspirators named in the expanded filing. The shipping network ran for 6 years. They estimate the stolen cargo value at somewhere above $11 million across the operational period. She paused. "The county is beginning forfeiture proceedings on Rourke Logistics assets, and a portion of those, a significant portion, is being directed to victim restitution and community programs." Cal was quiet for a moment. "How significant?" "The county commission voted yesterday. The community restitution allocation is $460,000. It covers direct victim compensation from the warehouse robbery, and the remainder goes to a county community program fund." Another pause, this one with something different in it. Not the efficient lawyer's pause, but the pause of someone who is about to say something that requires the other person to actually hear it. "The commission named the program, Cal. They voted on the name." He waited. "The Lost Creek Community Initiative," Rachel said. "Grant proposed it. It passed unanimously." The garage went quiet around him. Not the absence of sound, there were still the noises of a working shop. Bare in the far bay, the radio low on the parts shelf, but a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens inside a person when something lands that they didn't know was coming and that has too many edges to process all at once. "He should have called me first," Cal said. His voice was even. "Almost." "I know," Rachel said. "I told him that." "He said he knew it too." "Then why didn't he?" "Because he was afraid you'd say no," Rachel said. "And he thought the name was right." Cal sat with that. He thought about Grant Holloway, the man who had driven 5 patrol vehicles into his yard at dawn and put him on his knees in the mud and cuffed him in front of his daughter, and who had also driven a broken bus into his garage and stood in his yard on a Saturday morning and told the story that Cal had kept inside a vest lining for 17 years to strangers who needed to hear it. The man who had arrested him and the man who had helped clear him were the same man, which was a thing that required a more complicated relationship with forgiveness than Cal had previously needed to maintain. "Is it wrong?" Cal asked the name. "No," Rachel said. "Then I'll live with it," Cal said. He hung up and sat on the stool for another moment. Then he picked up his wrench and went back to the transmission. The federal guilty plea came 6 months after the arrest. Dale Rourke stood in the same Portland courthouse where the indictment had been filed and entered his plea on 11 counts: vehicle theft, conspiracy, evidence tampering, 3 counts of public corruption, obstruction of justice, kidnapping, intimidation, and 2 federal freight fraud charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. His attorney read a prepared statement expressing remorse. Rourke himself said nothing. He looked like a man who had already spent the intervening months calculating the cost and arriving at the arithmetic of someone who understood that the ledger was not going to balance in his favor. Pierce's testimony had been the cornerstone of the federal case, delivered in a voice that was quiet and precise and gave nothing more than what was asked for. He had traced every payment, every redirected patrol, every buried report, every conversation that had connected Rourke's operation to the county sheriff's department for 7 years. The prosecutor described his testimony as the most detailed and credible cooperative statement she had received in 14 years of federal prosecution. Pierce received a reduced sentence, 3 years, with eligibility for supervised release at 18 months in exchange for full cooperation. He surrendered his pension and his law enforcement credentials and pleaded guilty to obstruction and accepting bribes. The county began the review of every case he'd touched, which was a process that would take nearly 2 years and would result in 3 additional wrongful convictions being identified and sent to appeals courts. None of that made what Pierce had done right. It made it accounted for, which is a different thing, and the distinction mattered to the people whose lives had been touched by his choices. Cal understood the distinction. He didn't waste energy on the question of whether Pierce deserved the reduced sentence. That was the court's arithmetic, not his. What he spent time on in the quiet of the workshop after hours, in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a job and looked at nothing for a few seconds before going back to it, was the specific texture of being used. The particular violation of having your honest work, your professional integrity, your signature on a piece of paper, turned into the instrument of your own destruction. The chassis modification report that he'd written as a straightforward professional document and that had become, without his knowledge, the most dangerous thing in Rourke's operational landscape. He'd talked about it once with Bear late on a night in November when they'd been the last two in the garage and the work was done and neither of them was quite ready to go home. The thing that gets me, Cal said, is that I didn't do anything different. I did the same inspection I do every time. I wrote it up the same way. I put my name on it the same way. He looked at his hands. And that was exactly the thing they couldn't afford. Bear looked at him. And I keep going back to wondering what would have happened if I'd been less thorough, Cal said. If I'd rushed it, missed the chassis modification, signed off on it. Then Rourke's operation keeps running, Bear said. The warehouse robbery happens anyway. Some other person gets framed, or nobody does, and the operation runs for another 6 years. And you've got a signature on a truck you should have failed. He paused. But you'd still be running the shop. Yeah, Cal said. That bother you? That the right thing cost you more than the wrong thing would have? Cal was quiet for a long time. It bothers me that I can understand why Pierce made his choice, he said finally. His daughter was dying. The insurance said no. Rourke handed him away to save her, and it came with a price he thought he could manage, and then he couldn't. He looked at the floor. I'm not saying he was right. I'm saying I understand the math he was doing. And that bothers me, because understanding it makes it harder to be clean angry at him. Clean angry, Bear said. The kind where you're just right and they're just wrong, and there's nothing complicated in the middle, Cal said. I don't get to have that. Not with Pierce. Bear was quiet for a moment. Then, that's probably why you're a better man than most people give you credit for being. Or it means I'm bad at holding grudges, Cal said. Bear laughed. It was a big laugh, unguarded, the kind that only comes out when something is genuinely funny rather than politely so. Cal smiled, and it was the first time in weeks that Bear had seen that particular smile, the one that reached the eyes. They sat in the quiet of the garage for another half hour without saying much else, which was exactly what was needed. The Lost Creek Community Motor Works the name Cal had eventually agreed to. After 2 conversations with Grant and 1 with Madison in which she said simply, "It's the right name, Dad. Stop fighting it," opened its expanded operations the first weekend of December, not expanded in size. The garage was the same garage it had always been, expanded in what it did on that one Saturday each month. The free repair days had continued after the first one, growing steadily 29 the first time, 41 the second, 67 the third. By December, word had reached neighboring counties, and people were driving an hour to get there, which created its own logistical problem and its own kind of evidence about what happened when a community showed up for something honest. The Lost Creek Community Initiative funded parts. Local businesses, the hardware store, the diner, 2 of the auto parts suppliers who had been doing business with Cal for a decade donated materials. The Hells Angels provided labor, which they did with a collective competence that surprised some of the first-time visitors and surprised no one who knew the club. Madison ran the health component with 3 colleagues from the hospital. Basic screenings, blood pressure, medication reviews for the elderly, referrals for anything she wasn't equipped to handle on a folding table in a garage lot. She'd written a proposal for a mobile health clinic in January, a van, properly equipped, that could reach the remote families and aging riders and rural elderly who couldn't get to a doctor and couldn't afford not to. Rachel Monroe was helping her file for nonprofit status. The county health department had sent an observer to the December event who had left with her business card and the look of someone calculating how to get from where they were to what they'd just seen. Cal watched all of it from the position he was most comfortable in, slightly to the side. Doing work. He didn't run the days. He didn't make speeches. He fixed whatever came in, and he directed traffic between the bays, and he answered questions when people had them, and he let everyone else handle the parts that required talking to cameras and signing forms and making the public face of the thing. On the second Saturday of December, at 20 past 10 in the morning, a man arrived in a 10-year-old Subaru with a transmission that was slipping between second and third, and a check engine light that had been on so long the owner had stopped seeing it. He was in his early 30s, moderately tall, with the build of someone who sits at a desk most days and coaches youth sports on weekends. And he had the expression of someone who had driven a longer distance than he'd admitted to himself he was going to drive when he left home that morning. He pulled in and got out of the car and looked around the yard and then looked at Cal, who was coming out of the main bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Mr. Maddox," the man said. "That's me," Cal said. The man looked at him for a moment with the specific, careful look of someone who has rehearsed this exact moment many times and is now discovering that the rehearsal did not fully prepare him for the reality of it. "My name is Danny Holloway," he said. Cal went very still. It lasted just a beat, just the pause of a man whose body understands something before his prepared response catches up, and then he was steady again. The way he was always steady, the way that had taken him decades to build and had been tested harder in the past 6 months than in the 16 years before that. "Your car's slipping in second and third," Cal said. Danny Holloway blinked. Then something shifted in his face, not disappointment. Something more complicated, the recognition of a conversational style that doesn't perform emotion and doesn't require it to be performed back. "Yeah," Danny said, "I know. I've been putting it off. Transmission fluid's probably low. Could be the solenoid." Cal gestured toward the open bay. "Pull it in and I'll take a look." Danny pulled the Subaru into the bay. Cal put it on the lift. He worked in silence for a few minutes, checking the fluid level, reading the transmission code with the diagnostic tool, methodical and unhurried in the way that was simply how he worked rather than any deliberate performance of calm. Danny stood to the side and watched. He had the posture of a man who has something to say and is trying to figure out when the right moment is, which Cal recognized, because he'd spent most of his life in the same posture. "My father told me," Danny said finally. Cal didn't look up from the diagnostic reader. "I figured. He told me about the bus, about Lost Creek." A pause. "He said you were the volunteer who—" "Fluid's low," Cal said, "and the solenoid is showing a fault code. I can do the fluid today. Order the solenoid for Tuesday. It'll drive okay through the weekend if you're not doing highway speeds." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you going to let me finish a sentence?" Cal set down the diagnostic tool. He looked at Danny Holloway, this 31-year-old high school math teacher who had been 14 on an evacuation bus in the smoke, and who had grown up and built a life and driven an hour and a half this morning to stand in a garage in Briar Ridge and look at the man who had carried him out. "Yes," Cal said, "I'm sorry." "Go ahead." Danny looked at him. He had his father's eyes, the same directness, the same quality of attention that didn't look away from what it was looking at. "I don't remember it," he said. "I was already unconscious when you reached me. I didn't see your face. I don't have a memory of being carried." He paused. "But I've known my whole life that someone did that. That someone went into the smoke and came out with me and went back in. And I never knew the name." Cal said nothing. "My dad's been looking for 17 years, Danny said. "He had the patch. He showed everyone. Nobody knew." He stopped. "And then you were in the news for the worst possible reason. And my dad texted me saying there was something he needed to tell me." And he stopped again, pressed his lips together for a moment. "It took me a month to come here. I didn't know what I was going to say." "You don't have to say anything," Cal said. "I know," Danny said. "I came anyway." Cal looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the man who had died that day, Rios, who had 4 kids, who had gone into the north section, where the fire moved faster than the forecast. He thought about why he'd kept the patch hidden, and what it had meant to wear it inside rather than out, and whether that choice had been honest humility or something closer to self-protection. There was a man named Rios, Cal said. He was a better volunteer than I was. More experienced, steadier under pressure, the kind of person you want on your left when things go wrong. He looked at the floor for a moment. He died that day. He went to a section he was told was clear, and it wasn't, and the fire moved and he didn't make it out. He looked back at Danny. I wasn't willing to be anyone's rescue story on the same day his kids lost their father. So I left. Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then, that's the most complicated kind of right thing I've ever heard of. It wasn't a decision, Cal said. It was the only thing that made sense. And the patch? To remember what it cost, Cal said. Not me. All of us. Danny looked at him. He looked at the garage around them, the tools and the lifts and the workbench and the half-dozen riders moving between bays on a Saturday morning doing free work for people who needed it. He looked at the yard outside, where Madison was, at her screening table, and at Bear managing the queue of incoming vehicles with the efficiency of someone who has been organizing the controlled chaos of a Hells Angels event for 20 and has transferred that skill set to community automotive service. My dad said you told him to do his job right, Danny said. In the interview room, when you were the one in handcuffs, the case needed to be examined, Cal said. He said it's the thing that made him look harder. Danny looked at him. Not the patch, what you said. Cal considered that. He had said it because it was true, and because he'd believed Grant Holloway was a man who would respond to being handed a clear obligation rather than an emotional one. He hadn't said it to be wise or to demonstrate character. He'd said it because there was a warrant and a planted truck and a manufactured case, and the only thing that was going to dismantle it was proper police work done without compromise. And he'd needed Grant to be the person who could do that rather than the person who was looking for a reason to let the debt cancel the obligation. He did the job, Cal said. That's what mattered. He also stood in your yard and told a parking lot full of strangers what you did in 2008, Danny said. I heard about that. He shouldn't have done that without asking me, Cal said. No, Danny agreed. But you're glad he did. Cal looked at him. Then, slowly, something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the near neighbor of one. Your father's stubborn, he said. I know, Danny said. I grew up with it. He paused. He also something to me when he explained it all. He said the patch made him question what he thought he knew, and your choices gave him the answer. He held Cal's eyes. I've been thinking about that a lot, about what it means when the thing that changes how someone sees you is just you being exactly who you already were. Cal said nothing. He let the sentence sit where it had landed. I teach math, Danny said. I tell my students that the answer is already in the problem. You just have to be willing to work it all the way through. He paused. I think you've been working things all the way through for a long time. Cal picked up the diagnostic tool again. Solenoid's going to be about $80 in parts, he said. No charge for labor. Danny looked at him. You don't have to. The fluid service is on the community program, Cal said. The solenoid is on me. He looked at Danny directly. It's not a transaction. It's just a car that needs fixing. Danny stood in the bay for another moment. He looked like he had more to say, and Cal could see that and let it be there without hurrying toward it or away from it. Can I come back? Danny said finally. Not for the car. Just can I come back sometime? Garage is open Monday through Saturday, Cal said. Community days are the second Saturday of the month. He paused. You can come anytime. Danny nodded. He looked at Cal one more time, with the expression of someone filing something away, not for sentiment, but for the kind of understanding that takes time to fully develop and needs to be carried a while before it can be spoken. He walked out of the bay into the December morning. Cal watched him go. He stood there for a moment with the diagnostic tool in his hand and the Subaru on lift and the sound of the garage around him, the impacts and the hydraulics and the radio and the low conversation between riders. Working a job in the next bay, and he breathed once, slowly through his nose. Then he went back to work. The charity ride was Madison's idea. She'd proposed it in January for the following spring as a fundraiser for the mobile clinic 25 miles through the county, organized by the club, open to any rider who wanted to join. Proceeds going to the equipment fund. She'd designed the route herself, using the county road maps and the knowledge of which stretches of road had the most rural residents who could see the clinic from their driveways and understand, viscerally, that it existed for them. She hadn't told her father about the route until 2 weeks before the ride. When she showed him the map, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. The route passed the old evacuation road out of the Lost Creek wilderness. Not through it, the road was a county preservation route now, closed to regular traffic but past the turnoff, past the sign that marked it. "You did that on purpose," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the map. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you've been carrying that road for 17 years, she said. "And I thought it should get to see you on the other side of it." She held his eyes. "You don't have to ride past it. We can adjust the route." "Don't adjust the route," he said. The morning of the ride arrived clear and cold, the kind of Oregon spring morning that feels like a promise being seriously made after a long winter of qualified ones. 53 riders had registered. By the time the column assembled, there were 61, the additional 8 having shown up at the last minute because someone had heard about it and told someone who told someone, which is the specific mathematics of how things that are worth showing up for actually fill. Grant Holloway was there. Out of uniform again, this was becoming a pattern. The deliberate civilian presence at events connected to Maddox and the community program, a choice that said something about the difference between official participation and personal commitment. He wasn't riding. He was standing at the assembly point with Danny beside him, which was the first time Cal had seen them together, and the similarity between them was immediate and unmistakable. The same stance, the same quality of attention, the slightly different relationship each of them had worked out with the world's tendency to move faster than the truth. Madison found Cal at the front of the column, pulling on his gloves. She was on her own bike, a smaller one, nothing like the heavy road machines the club riders preferred, but hers, bought with 3 years of nursing shifts and maintained by her father with the same care he gave to everything that was hers. "Ready?" she said. He looked at the column behind him. 61 riders bare directly behind him, as always. Riders from the club and riders he didn't know, and a few who had come from neighboring counties specifically because they'd heard what the day was for. He looked at Madison beside him. Nursing scrubs traded for riding gear, her hair under the helmet, her eyes bright in the cold morning air. "Yeah," he said. He started the engine. The column moved through Briar Ridge in the early morning light down Route 9, past the turnoff for the old fairgrounds, through the center of town where a handful of residents had come out to watch. Some of them waved. Some of them just watched. That was fine. The ride wasn't for the people watching. It was for the clinic and for the families on the rural routes and for the riders and for the road. They passed the hospital where Madison trained. She didn't look at it as they went by, but Cal saw the small straightening of her spine that meant she'd noticed. The way people notice the places that have cost them something and chosen to still be standing in front of. They turned onto the county road that ran past the Lost Creek turnoff at the 40-minute mark. Cal saw the sign from a distance, the brown preservation marker, the name of the road, the mileage to the wilderness boundary. He watched it come closer at riding speed, which gave him exactly long enough to feel everything it brought with it, and not long enough to do anything with it except carry it through. He didn't slow down. He didn't look away. He rode past it at the same steady speed he'd been holding the whole route, and he felt the road that had been inside him for 17 years acknowledge itself and settle, slightly, into something that was not gone, but was different, more external, more finished. Madison rode beside him and said nothing. She didn't need to. Behind him, 60 riders who didn't know what that stretch of road meant to the man at the front simply kept the column together and moved through the morning, which was exactly the right thing to do. They finished the route at the garage. When the last engine cut off and the quiet settled, the fundraising total was announced by the local county program liaison, a woman from the health department who had been at December event and who had spent the subsequent 3 helping Madison navigate the nonprofit paperwork with the specific passionate efficiency of someone who had found a cause she believed in and intended to make it work. The total was $47,200, enough for the van, the basic medical equipment, the first 6 months of fuel and supplies. The crowd reacted with the particular noise of people who hadn't quite believed the number was going to be that number. Madison pressed both hands to her mouth for a moment. She recovered faster than she might have 6 months ago, because she'd been practicing the art of receiving good things without immediately qualifying them. And she turned to the group and said, "This is the van. This is the clinic. This is what we're doing." Bear started the applause. It spread through the crowd in the way that applause does when it's genuine rather than obligatory, which sounds different, which anyone who has heard both knows the difference between immediately. Cal stood at the edge of it and watched it happen around him. He clapped once, twice, then stopped because it wasn't his moment, and he knew it. Grant appeared at his elbow. "She's going to change things," Grant said. Looking at Madison, "She already has," Cal said. They stood there together for a moment, the mechanic in the leather vest and the sheriff in the flannel jacket. Two men who had arrived at a complicated honesty about each other through a process neither of them would have chosen and neither of them would undo. "I want to show you something," Grant said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small object, a glass-fronted mount, the kind used to display a single meaningful item, the kind Grant had kept in his study at home for 17 years. Inside it, mounted on a piece of backing, were 2 patches, the scorched Lost Creek volunteer patch Grant's family had kept, and a new mount bracket beside it, empty. "I had this made," Grant said. "I want to put your patch in it. The original one. The one from your vest." He held it out. "I want you to have the display. Both patches together. What the day cost and what it saved." Cal looked at the mount. He looked at the empty bracket. He looked at Grant. He reached into the lining of his vest. His fingers found the patch by feel. He could have found it with his eyes closed, had found it that way 10,000 times in 17 years. He worked the stitching loose from the inside lining, carefully. The way you remove something you've kept carefully. He held the faded square of embroidered cloth in his palm for a moment. He handed it to Grant. Grant took it. He looked at it. He looked at Cal. "It should be displayed," Grant said. "No," Cal said. He closed Grant's hand around the patch. "It should be with the people it belongs to. You and Danny." He held Grant's gaze. "It was never mine to keep. I was just the one carrying it." Grant stood there with the patch in his closed hand and the complicated expression of a man receiving something he hadn't known how to ask for and hadn't expected to be given. "Thank you," he said. "It came out rougher than he intended." "Thank you for looking closer," Cal said. They stood there in the noise and movement of the gathered community, the riders and the clinic supporters and the county health liaison and the neighbors who had come out and the few who had filmed an arrest 6 months ago and were now filming. Something different, and they looked at each other with the honest acknowledgement of 2 men who had done each other real harm and real good in close succession and were figuring out in real time what that meant for the distance between them going forward. It didn't mean they were the same. It didn't mean the harm was erased. It meant the good was also real, and real things built on other real things have a foundation that holds. Danny found Cal as the crowd was beginning to thin. He had a piece of paper in his hand, a hand-drawn map, the kind a person makes when they want to convey a specific set of directions in a way that feels personal rather than printed. "That's my school," Danny said, pointing to a mark on the map. "We have a career day in April. Every year I try to find someone who can talk to the kids about skilled trades, about what it actually looks like to spend your working life being good at something with your hands." He held the map out. "Would you come?" Cal looked at the map. He looked at Danny. He thought about what it meant to stand in front of a room full of young people and be asked to explain what your life's work had earned you after a year that had stripped it down to its components and forced everyone involved to examine what was actually there. "Yes," Cal said. "Yeah?" Danny looked slightly surprised. as though he'd prepared for a longer conversation. Yes, Cal said again. Danny smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that doesn't perform as itself. Great, he said. I'll send you the details. He folded the map and put it back in his pocket and went to find his father. And Cal watched him go and thought about the specific improbability of all of it, the arrest and the patch and the 17 years in the tire tracks, and the pilot light on Harlan Greer's generator, and Madison at her screening table and the bus. Running clean through a November morning and 61 riders through the county, and the empty bracket in a glass mount, and a math teacher handing a mechanic a hand-drawn map. None of it was a story he would have written. Not one element of it was what he would have chosen, if choosing had been on the table. All of it was true. All of it was his. He turned back toward the garage. Bear fell into step beside him without a word. Good day, Bear said. Yeah, Cal said. The kid Danny, he's all right, he is, Cal said. They went inside. Cal pulled on his work gloves. He looked at the bay where the Subaru had been, where the bus had been, where 40 years of people's vehicles had come in broken and gone out running. He looked at the vest hanging on the hook by the door. The inside lining, where the patch had lived since 2008, was smooth now, empty. What had been there was where it should be in Grant's hand, on the way to a glass mount on a wall where Danny could see it whenever he wanted to. Cal put on the vest without looking at the lining. He zipped it and reached for the first work order of the afternoon. Bear was already at the lift. The radio was on. The day was still full. That was enough. That was, in the end, what everything had always been about, not the vindication or the community days or the clinic or the charity ride or the name on the building, though all of those things were real and mattered. What it had always been about was the daily, undramatic, unglamorous work of being exactly who you were, with your name on everything you did, and trusting that the truth of that, even when it was hidden inside a vest lining, even when it was buried under a manufactured case, even when it was filmed on a neighbor's phone and uploaded before the patrol car reached the end of the road, would eventually find its way to the surface. Because honest things do. Given enough time and enough people willing to look closely, honest things always do. Cal Maddox pulled on his gloves, picked up his wrench, and got back to work. The patch was gone from his lining. His name was still on everything he touched. That was the only display he had ever needed.